When I was around 10, our family used to go on camping trips during the summer. We had this old white and blue caravan that my dad kept parked in the driveway all year until June rolled around. Then he'd take a couple of weekends to clean it, fill the water tank, test the lights, and repack all the gear. My parents were into simple spots, places with lakes, a few pine trees, maybe a little fire pit ring, not some big crowded campground with a bunch of other families. It was usually just us, parked in some quiet spot in the woods or in the back area of a public forest. That summer, I remember my sister and I thought we were old enough to sleep in our own tent. We'd been talking about it all year. She was 13 and I was almost 11, and we both thought it would be a cool way to feel independent while still being right next to the caravan. We had begged my dad to set up a little dome tent just for us, one of those cheap green nylon ones you buy from the outdoor aisle in a supermarket. Eventually, he gave in and said we could use it, but only if we set it up close. He staked it directly in front of the caravan door, like 10 feet away, so that the front of the tent basically faced the caravan steps. The day we arrived at the camping spot, it was late afternoon. I remember it was a clearing beside a small lake, surrounded by thick pine forest. The sun was low, and the air was that kind of sticky warm that made your shirt cling to your back. We helped unpack the caravan and got the little tent set up while my mom started cooking. We laid down 2 inflatable mattresses side by side inside it, with our sleeping bags zipped up and laid flat like bedding. We even set our flashlights near our pillows and stacked a couple of books between us, planning to stay up late reading. That first night, everything started out fine. We were excited, whispering about how cool it was to finally sleep outside the caravan. The walls of the tent were thin enough that we could still hear my parents talking and moving around inside. We had the flap zipped down but left the mesh window open, so we could see the faint glow of the caravan porch light and the silhouette of trees beyond it. The lake was behind us, about 20 yards away through some short grass and a line of cattails. For a while, we lay there listening to crickets and watching tiny moths flick around the light. I could hear my sister's breathing slow down and figured she was dozing off, so I tried to close my eyes and relax too. I remember the way the tent felt a little too warm, and how the plastic smell of the air mattress mixed with the clean scent of pine needles outside. The nylon walls flapped slightly with every small gust of wind, and you could hear the distant water sloshing against the lake shore. Nothing seemed wrong at all. Then, after what felt like an hour, I heard a soft sound. It was subtle at first, like the tent brushing against grass. I thought it was just the wind, so I ignored it. But then it came again, slow, dragging, like something rubbing up against the outer fabric. Not a flap or flutter, but a sound that felt deliberate, like someone was pressing against the side and slowly moving along it. At first, I held my breath and tried to listen harder. I thought maybe my sister had shifted in her sleep and caused it, or maybe it was something outside, like a raccoon brushing past. But the sound came again, this time more clearly. A long, steady rub, low to the ground, almost like someone was dragging their hand along the bottom edge of the tent. My skin started to prickle, and my mind jumped straight to the worst possibilities. I pictured someone creeping around out there, crouched low, moving silently around our tent. I tried to sit up slowly without making any noise, just to look toward the direction of the sound. But all I could see was the greenish-black fabric of the tent walls. The noise stopped for a few seconds, then started again on the other side, like something had moved around to the back and was rubbing along the rear wall now. I could feel the tension in my chest growing tighter. I glanced at my sister, and I could tell she was awake too, lying completely still, her eyes wide open, staring at me. Neither of us said anything, we just kept lying there, frozen. Every now and then, the sound came back, always low, always slow, always somewhere around the base of the tent. It never sounded like sniffing or scratching, which made it worse somehow. Scratching would have made me think of an animal. But this sounded like someone sliding their hand along the nylon, smooth and steady. At some point, we must have made a noise or moved, because I remember hearing my parents' footsteps outside. I don't remember exactly how we got out of the tent. I think we may have just started crying or yelling. The next thing I clearly remember is standing barefoot on the ground with the tent flap open, and my dad walking around the area with a flashlight, checking the bushes and shining the beam toward the lake. He didn't find anything. No footprints, no movement in the woods, nothing near the water. After a few minutes, he told us to calm down and go back inside the tent. I remember crawling back in, our sleeping bags feeling cold now, even though the air was still warm. My sister and I didn't speak. We just lay there listening. For a while, it was quiet. But then, maybe half an hour later, the sound came again. Even quieter this time, but still clear. That same brushing, low and deliberate, moving slowly along the tent wall behind us. We didn't last long after that. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the flap, and crawled straight into the caravan. My sister was right behind me. We ended up sleeping on the floor inside, squeezed between the table and the cabinets, wrapped in our sleeping bags. I don't think either of us got much rest that night. My parents didn't say anything about it the next morning. Maybe they thought we were overreacting, or maybe they knew we were just scared and didn't want to embarrass us. Either way, we never went back in the tent after that. Over the next couple of days, the tent stayed empty. It sat there in front of the caravan like a little green lump, still fully set up, with our sleeping bags and mattresses inside. We played near it during the day, but we always kept our distance at night. I remember one evening, I was walking back from the lake and saw the tent from behind. The shape of it was strange, slightly sagged on one side, like the ground underneath had shifted. I didn't think much of it at the time. It wasn't until our last day there that we found out what had actually been going on. My dad was packing things up and started to take down the tent. He pulled out the stakes and began rolling it up, and that's when he noticed the ground underneath wasn't flat anymore. There were little mounds and dips in the dirt, almost like the earth had been pushed up from below. He took a closer look and started poking around with a stick. Turns out some animals, probably moles or voles, had built tunnels directly under the tent. The tunnels ran right beneath where our heads and feet had been while we were lying inside. The movement we heard wasn't someone outside brushing the tent. It was small animals underground, pressing against the underside of the fabric as they burrowed and moved. The sound must have echoed through the plastic floor and thin air mattresses, making it seem louder and closer than it really was. We never felt them moving under us because of the air mattresses, but the pressure of their bodies against the ground, brushing the tent wall from below, had made that eerie, dragging sound that scared us half to death. It all made sense then. The strange timing, the way the sound moved from one side to the other, the way it came and went so silently. I remember standing there, staring at the shallow trails in the dirt and feeling half embarrassed and half relieved. It wasn't a stranger sneaking around our tent. It wasn't anything dangerous or creepy, just a few blind little creatures going about their business underground. We had scared ourselves senseless over something completely harmless. Looking back now, it's funny. One of those stories you retell at dinner years later, laughing at how worked up we got. But at the time, lying there in the dark, hearing those soft dragging sounds, it was terrifying. When you're a kid, your brain fills in the blanks with the worst possible things. And a quiet night in the woods can make you believe all kinds of stuff when all you have is a thin layer of nylon between you and the dark. That summer was the last time we tried to sleep outside the caravan. After that, my sister and I stuck to the fold-out beds inside. We still went camping most years, still went swimming in the lakes and cooked hot dogs on the fire, but the little green tent stayed packed away in the garage. And every time I heard a rustle in the bushes or a scratch on the ground, I always remembered that night, lying still and wide-eyed, imagining something that was never really there. It's strange how your senses can fool you like that, especially when you're tired and surrounded by darkness. The smallest noise can seem huge, and your imagination fills in the rest. But in the end, it wasn't anything bad. Just the quiet, harmless movement of the earth below us. Something we couldn't see, but something that was always there, whether we noticed it or not. It was early September, one of those times when the weather in North Georgia walks the line between the tail end of summer and the first hints of fall. The days were still hot enough to break a sweat doing just about anything, but the evenings cooled down just enough to make camping feel like the right idea. Me and a friend I'd known since high school had been talking about doing a weekend camping trip for a while. We both lived in Atlanta, and the idea of getting far away from city traffic, apartment walls, and the noise that comes with it had been building for months. We didn't plan anything too fancy. Just 2 nights in the woods, hammocks, some campfire meals, a cooler full of food, and enough time to unwind. We aimed for a spot somewhere near the Chattahoochee National Forest, not too far from the Tennessee border. We weren't even exactly sure where we were going when we left. We figured we'd just drive north, stop at a ranger station, or pull into a spot we liked along a Forest Service road. The trip was meant to be loose like that. Just get away, drink a little, maybe hike some, and sleep without hearing sirens or car horns. We were about 2.5 hours out of the city when we pulled into a tiny town that seemed like it had been left behind a few decades ago. I couldn't even tell you the name of it. There was one gas station that had a little grocery store attached to it, a couple of empty-looking buildings along the main road, and not much else. We figured we'd better stock up on snacks, water, and most importantly, beer. The cooler in the trunk had room, and we were ready to start the weekend right. The grocery section was small, the kind of place where there's one cooler of soda, a shelf of bread and canned goods, and a fridge with milk and eggs. We loaded up on chips, jerky, hot dogs, and matches. When we got to the fridge with alcohol, it took about 2 seconds to realize there wasn't any. No beer, no wine, no nothing. At first, we thought they were just sold out. But then we saw a laminated sign taped above the fridge door that said something like, "Alcohol not sold in this county. We thank you for your understanding." Neither of us had known that dry counties were still a thing, but apparently they are, at least in parts of North Georgia. We didn't think much of it. It was kind of funny, in a small-town way. We still wanted to grab some drinks before heading into the woods, though. So, after we paid for our stuff, we asked the cashier if there was anywhere nearby we could buy beer or maybe a bar where we could have a drink before setting up camp. She pointed us toward a county line that was about a 10-minute drive away, told us there was a bar just across it. She gave us directions. Not a name, not an address, just go down the highway, turn left after the closed bait shop, and look for a white building with a screened-in porch. It sounded like it was kind of known around there, so we figured why not, we'd just stop, have 1 or 2 drinks, maybe talk to some locals, and then head to the campsite. We got back on the road and followed her directions. The sun was just starting to go down, and that orange haze settled over everything, giving the trees and fields this warm glow that almost made the whole area look peaceful. There were fewer and fewer cars as we drove, and after about 10 minutes, we took the turn she mentioned, right at the edge of what looked like an old, abandoned bait and tackle shop. The road got narrower, then gravelly, then just turned into packed dirt with grass growing up the middle in places. We slowed down. The woods closed in more on both sides. It didn't feel like there was going to be a bar out here. There were no other cars parked along the road, no neon signs, no music. But after a couple more minutes of creeping along, we saw it. It was a small, low building, maybe 1 story tall, with white wood siding that was stained from years of rain and dirt. Every window was bricked up, literally cinder blocks stacked and mortared in where the windows should have been. There wasn't a single sign anywhere, not even one that said open or bar or anything at all. The only light was a single bulb hanging over the door, which had a loose screen door that flapped slightly even though there wasn't any wind. It looked like someone had thrown the whole place together from leftover parts. The porch sagged in the middle, and the only sound was the buzz of that light. We parked the car right out front and just sat there, neither of us making a move to get out. We stared at it. It didn't look right. It didn't feel like the kind of place where people went to drink after work or grab a beer with friends. It looked like the kind of place where something went wrong. After a few minutes, we both laughed a little to break the tension. The only thing we could think of was how much it looked like something out of Deliverance. Same backwoods, same quiet. We half joked about it being the kind of place where you go in and don't come back out. But we were only half joking. We didn't even try the door. After sitting there for a minute longer, both of us silently came to the same decision. We didn't need a drink that bad. I started the car and we turned around slowly, backing down the dirt road until we could turn around without running into the trees. We didn't see anyone, didn't hear anyone. It was like the whole area was empty. We drove back toward the main road without another word. By then, it was getting fully dark, and we just headed straight to the campsite. We found a pull-off along a forest road a little deeper into the national forest and set up hammocks between some pines. We got a fire going, cooked some hot dogs, cracked open a few sodas, and tried to shake off how weird that place had felt. That night, I didn't sleep that well. Every crack of a branch or rustle in the leaves had me sitting up, flashlight in hand. It wasn't that I was afraid of animals, though black bears are around, but that building had set something off in my head that I couldn't explain. Just this feeling that we had been close to something we shouldn't have been close to. Something just didn't fit. The next day was better. The sun came up clear, the air was crisp, and after breakfast we went for a short hike to a nearby creek and just spent the day out in the woods. There were a few other campers around, some tents set up in the same general area. Most looked like locals. One guy had a truck with some small town's fire department sticker on it, and another had a dog that kept coming over to sniff around our site. That afternoon, we ended up chatting with a couple of them. It was casual stuff, weather, trail conditions, how cold it got the night before. At some point, the topic of beer came up again, and I mentioned how we had gone looking for a bar just across the county line. I described the place and said we turned around because it looked sketchy. I figured maybe someone knew the place and could tell us if it was just a dive bar or something else. The first guy went quiet for a second, then asked again where exactly we had been. I gave him the same rough directions the cashier had given us. His eyes narrowed slightly and he shook his head. He didn't say much, just something along the lines of, "I wouldn't go near that place again." Later on, a different camper, a woman maybe in her 40s, overheard us talking about it and said the same thing, only she was more direct. Said that place wasn't a bar, never had been. Said people had gone missing in that area before, and that we were lucky we didn't go inside. After that, we dropped the subject, but it sat heavy in my chest. I kept thinking about how easily we could have gotten out of the car, how we almost did, how we were right there, 10 steps from that door, the only light in miles flickering above it. I couldn't stop wondering why the cashier would send us there. Had she misunderstood us? Had she done it on purpose? We hadn't been rude. We hadn't pushed anything. But maybe we'd stood out and that was enough. Maybe some people like seeing what'll happen if they point strangers in the wrong direction. We left the next day, packed up early and didn't stop in that town on the way back. Didn't even look at it as we passed through. We didn't talk about it much afterward either. I think we both wanted to forget how close it had felt. Like stepping toward the edge of a cliff without knowing it was there. That building's still in my mind. The way the windows were bricked in, the sag in the porch, that bulb casting its cold, yellow light in a circle that ended in total blackness. It's not the kind of fear that jumps out at you, not like a movie scare. It's the kind that builds slowly the more you think about it. What was behind those walls? What would have happened if we went in? Why was it there at all? It's easy to write things off when you're back in your apartment, safe with traffic outside and city lights all around. But out there in the middle of nowhere, where your phone has no signal and the woods feel endless, things feel different. And sometimes you don't get a second chance to make the right decision. We were lucky we got one, and I don't think we'll ever test that kind of luck again. My friend Megan and I had been planning for weeks to go to a 3-day outdoor music festival in North Carolina. We had packed the car the night before, coolers full of cheap beer and snacks, folding chairs, our small tent, a sleeping bag each, a Bluetooth speaker, and enough rolling papers to last a week. I'd taken Friday off work, and Megan had wrapped up her shifts early. We were already in the car, pulling out of her driveway that morning when I got the push notification on my phone. The festival was canceled. Weather damage to the main stage or something. No refunds. Just like that, the whole thing was off. At first, we just sat there in her driveway with the engine idling, stunned. Megan looked ready to scream. We were packed, had the whole weekend open, and had psyched ourselves up for it for days. But once the initial annoyance wore off, we agreed. Screw it. We were already ready to go. There was no way we were staying home. We'd just drive. Head north, get out of the city, and find a place to camp. Some peace, nature, and a few nights of partying. We both liked the idea better the more we talked about it. No crowds, no security checkpoints, just the woods and our own plans. We didn't have a destination in mind. Megan opened up Google Maps and started looking at green patches with lake icons. About 3 hours later, we were upstate in a quiet area that looked like it had once been some sort of summer resort town. There were boat rental shops closed for the season, a faded sign for a mini golf course that had probably shut down in August, and a couple of boarded-up diners. But the lake was beautiful, glassy, with the trees all around it starting to change into reds and yellows. It was the end of September, still warm during the day, but you could feel fall creeping in. We found a campground that was technically still open, though it looked deserted. A narrow driveway led us into a loop where there was a small wooden building with a hand-painted check-in sign on the roof. The windows were fogged up from the inside, and there was a dented soda machine out front. We pulled up, and an older guy came out from the booth, wearing a red flannel shirt tucked into jeans. He looked like he had probably spent every year of his life within 10 miles of that place. He was polite enough, smiled, nodded, gave us a map of the campground, and circled the site he said would give us plenty of privacy. It was also the last one available, supposedly, though the place looked totally empty. We drove down a gravel road through the woods for a few minutes before pulling into a little opening in the trees. Site 48. It was way out there, tucked up against the far edge of the campground loop, with trees on 3 sides and the last of the camping markers behind us. No other cars, no fires burning, no sound except wind moving through the trees. It was quiet in that strange way that makes you hyper-aware of your own breathing. I didn't mind. We came to be alone. We cracked open a couple beers and unpacked everything. The site was pretty nice, fairly level ground, a fire pit with a steel ring around it, and a big flat area perfect for pitching the tent. There was even a thin trail that seemed to lead down to the lake, maybe a 10-minute walk away. We set up the tent first, then laid out a couple of blankets and some folding chairs. Megan got the speaker going and rolled one while I stacked some firewood nearby. No one came by, no park ranger, no other campers, just us, a wide open sky, and a half-empty bottle of rum. It was late afternoon when we finished setting up. We went for a short walk, followed the trail down to the lake and skipped a few rocks, just soaking it all in. The sun was already starting to dip when we got back. The temperature dropped fast. I got the fire going while Megan messed with her camera, trying to get artsy shots of the flames. We drank, messed around, and did exactly what we came to do. Nothing important. Just drink, joke, smoke a bit. That sort of warm, aimless, perfect rhythm where the world feels far away. Around 9, we cooked some hot dogs over the fire and split a bag of chips. By 10, we were buzzed. The fire had burned low, and we let it go out naturally. The air was getting cold, so we crawled into the tent. We had set up our sleeping bags on top of a couple of foam mats, side by side, with the cooler inside at our feet and a battery lantern hanging from the loop at the top of the tent. We sat for a few minutes just staring at the light, not saying anything, then Megan turned it off. We laid there in the dark, tired but not quite sleepy yet. It was that moment when everything feels perfectly still. That's when I heard the noise. It came from off to the left side of our campsite, just beyond the edge of our tent wall, maybe 100 yards or so out. The woods there were thick, and we knew from walking around earlier that those campsites were totally empty. But it was clear, so clear that it felt too deliberate to be anything natural. Metal on stone. A long, slow scraping sound. Not short like a clink. Not random. It was extended, careful. The unmistakable sound of a blade being sharpened. Maybe a knife. Maybe an axe. A slow drag like someone was really putting pressure into it. Then it happened again. And again. I froze for a second, then quietly sat up in my sleeping bag. Megan did the same. I didn't have to say anything. We were both hearing it. Over and over. Slow, steady, deliberate. Metal scraping rock. Then a pause. Then again. Each time the same length, same speed, like whoever it was didn't care who heard it. Or maybe they wanted us to hear it. I reached over and quietly pulled the cooler closer, grabbing the can of bear mace we'd thrown in almost as a joke. Megan was wide-eyed. I could see the outline of her face in the faint light coming through the nylon from the moon outside. We listened for maybe 20 minutes. The sound kept going, sometimes with small breaks between strokes, sometimes in longer stretches. Always from the same spot, always with the same tone. Then Megan handed me her phone. She had opened the campground info page and pulled up the number for the front booth. She typed it in and pressed call. A few seconds later, I could hear a distant phone ringing, way off. Then it clicked and someone picked up. I couldn't hear the voice on the other end, but I saw Megan's face stiffen as she listened. Then she hung up and handed me the phone. The guy was still in the booth. It was a half-mile away from us, at least. He hadn't left. There was no one else in the campground. We were the only registered guests. And yet, just as we sat there staring at each other, the sound started again. Slow, metal dragging against stone. Unmistakable, over and over. I don't know how long we sat there before we decided to move. We crawled out of the tent as quietly as we could, shivering as the cold air hit us. No moon by then, just faint starlight, and our breath coming out in clouds. I grabbed the bare mace, and we tiptoed to the car, keeping our heads low, like we thought someone might be watching us. Once we got in and locked the doors, we didn't say anything. We reclined the seats a little and just sat there, frozen, listening. The sound was still going, maybe a bit fainter now, maybe not. Megan eventually fell asleep, or at least drifted off, her face half covered by a blanket. I stayed awake. I couldn't stop staring out through the windshield into the trees. I kept expecting to see movement, a silhouette, a light, anything, but there was nothing, just darkness and that sound. Scraping, then silence, then scraping again. It went on for hours. Shortly before sunrise, maybe around 5 a.m., it stopped, just like that, no fading out, just one last scrape and then nothing. I stayed in the car, unmoving, until the sky started to lighten. The first bits of color came in behind the trees, soft gray and pale blue. Megan stirred beside me, groggy and cold. I unlocked the doors and stepped out to stretch, my limbs stiff from the cramped seat. It was dead quiet. The fire pit was cold. The tent stood there untouched. I walked over to the spot where I thought the sound had come from. There was nothing. No footprints, no gear, no signs that anyone had even walked through the area. I walked out to the next couple of campsites. Still nothing. Not a wrapper. Not a footprint. Just dry leaves and empty dirt patches. We didn't stay another night. We didn't even make breakfast. We packed up the tent in silence, tossed everything back into the car, and drove out past the booth. The attendant waved at us again. We waved back without stopping. We didn't talk about it much on the way home. Just music and occasional comments about how cold it had gotten. But the sound still lingers with me, like a stuck memory. That deliberate, metallic scraping. Not rushed, not accidental, just slow, focused strokes. I've gone camping plenty since then, but I've never heard that sound again. And I never go anywhere without checking who's around and how far away the nearest occupied site is. Nothing ever happened. No one ever came out of the woods. But sometimes the scariest thing is exactly that. Something you hear but can't see. Something that doesn't need to show itself. Just lets you know it's there. And if it had wanted to come closer, it could have. But it didn't. That might be the worst part. When I was in high school, a few friends and I planned a camping trip that we'd been talking about for months. We wanted to go somewhere really remote, somewhere that didn't have other campers or families nearby, no noisy groups, no one blasting music out of Bluetooth speakers. We wanted complete isolation. One of my friends, Josh, had heard of this spot deep in the Colorado mountains. He said it was a box canyon, surrounded on all sides by tall cliffs, and the only way in or out was through one long, rough road. Supposedly, it used to be more popular with off-roaders and hunters, but recently people had stopped going. He didn't really know why. We all had four-wheel drive vehicles, but only one of them was built to really handle tough off-roading. That was Matt's Jeep Cherokee, which had a lift kit, oversized tires, winch, and a roof rack for gear. The plan was to use his Jeep to carry most of our camping stuff and follow behind in two other cars. My older Tacoma and Josh's 4Runner. We packed everything we could think of: tents, tarps, sleeping bags, water jugs, freeze-dried food, flashlights, extra batteries, a camping stove, first aid kits, even bear spray. We left early in the morning on a Friday in June. As soon as we turned off the paved highway, the trail got rough. It was nothing like the dirt roads you usually find out in the woods. This was barely a road at all. It looked more like a dry riverbed most of the time. There were long stretches of deep sand, then huge rocks sticking up like broken teeth, and every so often a sharp turn that dipped down into a shallow creek crossing. In some places, tree branches scraped against the side of our cars, and we had to stop and clear fallen limbs or loose boulders out of the way. We took our time. At every obstacle, Matt would go first, then we'd follow carefully, walking sections of the trail to plan our path. There were a few sketchy moments where tires slipped or bottomed out, but somehow we made it through. What struck me right away was how quiet it was. No tire tracks, no signs of campers, no wrappers or trash near the clearings. Normally, on remote Colorado trails, you see other trucks or at least old fire pits or boot prints, but this road felt untouched. By the time we made it to the canyon, it was late afternoon. The sun was still up, but shadows from the tall cliff walls had already spread across the floor of the valley. The air was cool, and the light had that soft, blue tint you only get in places that don't see much direct sun. We found a flat area near a dry creek bed and started setting up camp. There was plenty of room for our tents and a fire ring. We gathered wood from deadfall nearby and stacked it. We didn't see or hear any animals. No birds, no squirrels, not even insects. It was strangely quiet. Once the tents were up and we'd had something to eat, we settled into our usual camping routine. That meant building a fire, cracking open a few beers, and telling dumb stories from school. Once it got dark enough, we set up for our usual night game, capture the flag. We'd done this every trip since we were kids. We split into 2 teams, each hiding a glow stick in a certain area, then used the woods and brush for cover to sneak and search. It made the nights more fun and gave us something active to do after dark. I was on a team with Josh, and we decided to try using the road that led through the canyon to get around behind the other team's zone. The road was about 20 feet above the floor of the canyon at some points, cut into the hillside, and gave a pretty good view of the terrain. We figured it'd be easier to stay hidden and spot the flag from above. So we climbed up and started walking. We didn't have headlamps on because we didn't want to give away our position. We just moved slowly, using the moonlight and our phones when necessary. About 10 minutes in, while walking a section of the road that was wide and flat, we noticed a soft glow coming toward us. At first, we thought it might be a car. The light had that distinct white-blue tone of headlights, and it was bouncing slightly as it moved. But it didn't have the double beam pattern, and there wasn't any engine noise. It was dead silent, aside from our own steps. We stopped and watched. As it got closer, we realized it was a person. A young woman, probably in her early 20s, wearing jeans and a sweater, walking quickly with her phone held up in front of her, the screen lighting her face. She was stumbling as she moved, almost tripping over nothing, and kept looking around like she was trying to get her bearings. The way she walked wasn't like someone out for a hike. It looked like she was in a panic but trying not to show it. I felt frozen. Something about it didn't feel right. She wasn't dressed for hiking or camping. No backpack, no jacket tied around her waist, no water bottle. Just jeans, a sweater, and sneakers. The phone was clearly on, but she kept waving it around slowly, like she was looking for a signal. We stood just off the road as she passed us. She never looked at us, never reacted to the fact that there were 2 people standing there. We were barely 10 feet away from her. Her eyes were wide, glassy, and her face was wet with tears. She kept walking past, stumbling occasionally, still holding the phone out like a divining rod, like it would somehow guide her to safety. She didn't make a sound. Not a sob, not a sniffle, just those rushed footsteps on the dirt and gravel. We stood still for at least 30 seconds after she vanished around the next bend. Neither of us said anything. I remember how my chest felt tight, like something had sucked all the air out of me. Eventually, we turned around and made our way back to camp, forgetting the game entirely. Back at camp, we told the others what we saw. No one laughed it off. Everyone believed us immediately. Maybe it was the way we looked when we came back, or maybe the story just hit them the same way it hit us. After some quiet discussion, We decided not to go looking for her in the dark. Felt wrong, but something told us to stay close to camp. We agreed that at first light, we'd go down the canyon road and look for signs of where she might have come from. We barely slept. I lay in my sleeping bag with my heart pounding, thinking about that woman's face, how she never saw us, how her feet didn't seem to know where they were going. It didn't make sense. How had she gotten there? If she'd hiked in, she would have needed a technical route, ropes, climbing gear, possibly a guide. The cliffs were steep and crumbling. There were no other entry points. When morning came, we skipped breakfast and packed some snacks and water. We started by walking further down the canyon road, expecting to find a tent, a parked car, even just footprints leading off into the woods. But the road eventually dead-ended at a wall of rock and loose shale. There was nothing. Not a car, not a campsite, not even a fire pit. No signs of recent activity. The dirt wasn't disturbed. No new tire tracks, no footprints except our own from the night before. We hiked along the sides of the cliffs, looking for trails, ropes, discarded gear. Anything to suggest someone had come down into the canyon. Again, nothing. The loose stone along the base of the cliffs made climbing extremely difficult, and the vertical walls had no visible routes. We would have heard someone trying to come down. We would have seen damage to the brush or even broken branches. But there was none of that. After that, we decided to leave. We loaded up the cars and headed back down the trail toward the main road. Took the whole day to get out. We stopped at every clearing, every side trail, every patch of forest where someone could have camped or parked. We didn't see another soul the entire way. The whole trip back, there wasn't a single sign that another vehicle had used the road recently. No crushed vegetation, no oil spots or wrappers, no tire marks. When we finally reached the entrance to the road, we drove up and down the highway that connected to it, stopping at trailheads and Forest Service signs. Nothing. No lost posters, no groups, no hikers in the area. We even checked the parking lots of a couple ranger stations on the way back home. There weren't any open cases, no missing persons reports matching a woman like that. That was years ago. We all graduated, moved on, took different jobs in different towns. Some of us still keep in touch. That trip comes up sometimes, but not often. It's like we don't really want to relive it too closely. I still feel guilty, even though I know we couldn't have done much differently. We didn't have a way to help her, not without risking getting hurt ourselves or getting lost in the dark. But the image of her walking past us, crying silently, is stuck in my head. I see it sometimes when I close my eyes. The phone screen glowing on her face, the confusion and fear in her eyes. I've gone over it 1,000 times. Maybe someone brought her in and left her. Maybe she got lost trying to take a shortcut from some higher trail and ended up stuck in the canyon. Maybe she wandered in days earlier and had been trying to get out ever since. But that road was in rough shape. We were certain no one had been on it in weeks. Any fresh tire tracks would have stood out. And if she had come down the cliffs, we would have seen the rope or climbing gear she left behind. But there was nothing. It's not a ghost story. She was real, flesh and blood, just out of place, scared, and alone in a place that didn't make sense. That part is what gets me the most. Not the fear, not the mystery, but the way her presence broke the logic of the place. A person like that does. It happened a few years ago on a camping trip in Ontario. It was midweek, a Wednesday night if I remember correctly. That part sticks with me because the park was a lot quieter than it usually is on weekends. We had gone up there as a family, me, my brother, my parents, and their dog, and we stayed in a small trailer we used back then, nothing fancy. It was one of those aluminum-sided units from the early 2000s with a bunk at the back and a small bathroom inside. But the toilet didn't really work that well, so we mostly used the comfort stations, especially for anything beyond brushing teeth. It was a common setup in parks like that. The trailers were packed into loops around the woods with sites facing each other, lots of gravel pads, picnic tables, fire pits. And in the middle of every few loops, you'd have these bathroom buildings, big, well-lit with showers and flush toilets, even hot water if you went in the evening before too many people used it up. Our site that week was at the corner of the loop. It was a good one because it gave us a bit more space on one side and a little path in the back that cut through the woods to the bathroom. It wasn't an official trail, not something on a map, just a shortcut people had been using for years. Packed dirt, a few tree roots here and there, and barely 10 meters long. If you stood at the back of our site and looked past the trees, you could see the yellow light from the comfort station sign glowing faintly through the branches. Normally you'd walk around the gravel road out the front of the campsite and follow the loop for maybe 2 minutes, but the shortcut cut it down to less than a minute. I used it often enough that I could walk it half asleep without a flashlight. We were surrounded by families and older couples that night. I didn't expect anything weird. That night, I'd gone to bed around 10:30 after sitting at the fire with my brother for a while. The air had been cool, maybe 15 degrees Celsius, typical for a summer night up north. There were no clouds, and you could see a ridiculous number of stars once the campfires went out. I remember falling asleep easily after brushing my teeth and making sure the trailer doors were locked. Habit more than anything. I slept hard for a few hours. The trailer was quiet, and the small fan by my bunk made just enough white noise to drown out any rustling from the woods. Around 2 a.m., I woke up needing to use the bathroom. Not urgently, but enough that I knew I wasn't falling back asleep until I dealt with it. I didn't want to wake anyone else, so I carefully slid down from the bunk and grabbed my hoodie off the hook by the door. I didn't bother with shoes. I was just in sandals. I cracked the trailer door and stepped out into the cool night air. It was one of those nights where everything felt still. No wind, no talking, no crackling from fires. Just crickets and distant rustling. Most of the trailers had their awning lights off. A few had those dim blue bug lights on, but for the most part, the loop was asleep. I didn't bring a flashlight because my eyes had already adjusted. There was enough ambient light from the moon and some far-off campsite lanterns that I could see where I was going. I walked to the back of the site toward the shortcut without thinking twice. I'd used that path dozens of times. It was second nature. I stepped into the trees, following the narrow dirt trail that cut between the ferns and low-hanging branches. It was about halfway through that little shortcut when something felt off. Not immediately. I was walking steadily, focused more on not stubbing my toe on a root than anything else, when I heard a sound that made me stop. It was right by my left ear, faint but close, like a breath or a laugh. Not a full laugh, more like a short burst of giggling. The kind you might hear from a kid being sneaky, almost playful. It made me stop in my tracks. I turned, trying to see what it was. My first thought was raccoon. They make weird sounds, sometimes almost like chatter. I scanned the trees and underbrush, expecting to see the flash of eyes from my movement or hear something scurrying off, but I didn't see anything. The ferns weren't moving. The leaves overhead were still. I leaned forward, listening, trying to hear if anything was moving through the forest floor, but nothing. Not even a twig snapped. That struck me as odd. I waited another couple seconds, still staring into the brush, then started walking again, but a little faster. I figured it had to be some animal I startled, and it was probably already gone. The trail was only about 10 meters long, and I was more than halfway through. But then, just as I was about to reach the brighter area where the trees started thinning out and the comfort station lights lit the path, I heard something else. This time it was behind me, farther back in the woods. Not in the trail, but deeper into the forest, maybe 10 or 15 meters away. A voice, not loud, not shouted. Just a simple, clear hello. Female, mid-range, and completely out of place. It wasn't panicked or urgent, just calm, like someone testing if another person was nearby. It didn't echo. It was as if the trees swallowed the sound. My stomach dropped. Every hair on my neck stood up. It was such a casual sound, but it didn't make any sense. There was no one back there. I'd just come from the trailer, and the whole loop was dark. No fires, no late-night music, no movement. No one had passed us on the road when I stepped out. I hadn't heard any footsteps on the gravel. And the thing that really got me was how soft it was. It didn't carry like a normal voice in the woods does. It was too close and too quiet. I bolted, full sprint. Didn't think, didn't look back, just ran. My foot caught on a half-buried root or maybe a log that was hard to see in the dark. I hit the ground hard and felt a ripping sensation across my shin as my leg scraped something sharp, probably a broken branch. I rolled, got up, and ran the rest of the way to the comfort station, not stopping until I hit the pavement in front of the building. The lights outside were bright and buzzing with moths. The door was unlocked, and I went inside, locking the stall behind me and sitting there for longer than I needed to. My heart was pounding. My leg stung. When I finally looked down, I saw a gash on my shin and a tear in my pajama pants. It wasn't deep enough for stitches, but it was bleeding a bit and already swelling. I used paper towels and tap water to clean it off, then just stood there in front of the mirror trying to calm down. I didn't believe in anything paranormal. I studied biology. I've camped for years. I've heard foxes scream, owls hiss, raccoons chatter, even deer snort in the dark. I knew the way sound played tricks in the trees. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe even another camper messing around, though who'd be in the middle of the woods at 2 a.m. whispering hello made no real sense. After maybe 15 minutes, I decided to head back, but I wasn't going through the woods again. No chance. I took the longer route, walking along the gravel road under the full moon. The light helped, but I still kept checking behind me. As I passed the side entrance to the shortcut, the part where the trail connects back to the road, I gave it a wide berth. The trees there looked darker, thicker than I remembered. That's when I heard the last thing. Just as I walked past the opening, I swear I heard it again. This time even softer, but as clear as anything I've ever heard. A whisper, right at the edge of my hearing, almost like someone saying it from behind a tree or leaning close to a mic. Just 2 words. Come back. I ran again, all the way to the trailer. I fumbled with the latch, yanked the door open, slammed it behind me, and locked it. My leg was burning, but I didn't care. I climbed into the bunk, pulled the sleeping bag up to my chin, and lay there staring at the ceiling for over an hour, wide awake, listening. Nothing followed. No sounds outside. No footsteps. Just the fan and my heart beating in my ears. The next morning, I didn't say anything to my parents. They noticed my leg, asked what happened, and I told them I tripped going to the bathroom. It wasn't a lie, but I didn't mention the rest. They probably would have brushed it off anyway. That was the last trip we did with that trailer. The following season, they upgraded to a newer one with a full bathroom inside. Nothing fancy, but enough to avoid late-night trips in the dark. I didn't protest. Since then, I haven't used a comfort station alone at night. I don't care how familiar the trail is or how safe the park feels. I go before bed and that's it. I still think about that night sometimes, usually when I'm falling asleep in a tent or walking alone near woods. I've run through every logical explanation in my head dozens of times. Animal noises, people messing around, maybe even my brain misfiring from sleep. But no matter how many times I turn it over, there's a part of me that still remembers exactly how clear that voice sounded. Not animal, not imagination, just something human where it shouldn't have been. Maybe it was just some idiot trying to scare people. Maybe someone was out there, drunk or messing around, hiding off the trail for some reason. But if that's the case, they had to be standing in complete silence, waiting, not making a sound as I walked past. No footsteps, no rustling, just waiting. That's what unsettles me more than anything. Not knowing someone was there, knowing they didn't want to be found. That's what keeps me from using those shortcuts anymore. Not ghosts, not monsters. My girlfriend at the time and I had been together for almost 3 years when we decided to go camping to celebrate her birthday, which fell close to our anniversary. We'd never done anything like it before. I think both of us were looking for something quiet and different, something away from everything. We lived in the city, and life always felt busy. Between work, responsibilities, and the way the city never really seemed to sleep, we just wanted silence for a while. She had this idea of going somewhere far out in the woods where it would just be us, a tent, a fire, and the sky. I thought it sounded like a good idea too. We planned the whole thing out for weeks. The storm that hit the day before we left wasn't part of the plan, though. It was one of those spring storms that rolled in fast and hit hard. Lightning, heavy rain, high winds. The kind that floods streets and pulls tree branches down. We thought about postponing, but she was set on going and I didn't want to ruin her birthday. So we packed up early the next morning and hit the road. The drive was long, just about 5 hours into northern Georgia. It was mostly back roads once we left the highway, winding deeper into the forested areas where houses became fewer and long stretches passed without seeing anything but trees. Everything was still soaked from the storm. The ground looked muddy and there were puddles everywhere. Trees were leaning, bent or broken. It was like driving through the leftovers of something powerful. When we reached the campground entrance, the guy working the gate was standing under a small awning with a clipboard. He was wearing a poncho and rubber boots, and his face looked like he'd been out there for too long. He gave us our map and explained how to get to our assigned spot. Then he mentioned there wasn't anyone else staying there that weekend. Said everyone else had canceled after the storm. That should have been a red flag, but at the time we both looked at each other and smiled. It sounded perfect to us. A whole campground to ourselves. We thought it was going to be this peaceful, uninterrupted getaway. No people, no noise, just the woods and us. The roads leading into the campground started wide, gravel-lined with space to pass. But as we followed the map to our designated area, the road narrowed. Trees on either side grew close together, their wet branches reaching out toward the car. There were long stretches where I had to slow down just to squeeze through. No room to turn around. You'd have to back out the whole way if you wanted to leave. The farther we drove, the more boxed in we felt. It was like the trees were swallowing the road. It took longer than expected to reach our spot. When we did, the air felt heavier than it had before. We parked and started unloading. The ground was soft under our shoes, and every step made a squish sound. Setting up the tent was a slow process. We hadn't practiced, and we had to clear the wet leaves and sticks first, then hammer in the stakes on muddy ground. Everything was still damp, even the air. The fire pit was full of water and needed to be scooped out. I used a plastic cup we brought to bail it. We had to move a few large stones around to make it feel like our own space. After about an hour or so, we got the tent up, put our small cooler inside, and stretched out to rest. Later, we decided to walk around. It was still light out, maybe around 3 p.m. The sun was out, but not strong enough to dry anything. Everything still felt wet. The forest was quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful. It was just silent. There weren't any birds, no insects buzzing, no rustling. The only sound was our footsteps on the damp path. We didn't use a marked trail, we just wandered. The woods were thick, but not dense enough to block out light. It was easy to see 20 or 30 feet in any direction. After walking for a while, we reached this odd clearing. That's when we saw them, cabins. These small white buildings stood in a row. They were old-looking but in good shape. The paint wasn't chipped, and the roofs looked clean. But they had this weird uniformity to them. Each one was the exact same shape and size, with the same narrow windows and same steps leading up to their doors. No lights on.
No sounds.
No cars or signs of life around. It didn't look like part of a regular campsite. Felt hidden. They were far out from the center of the campground. We looked at them from the edge of the trees and didn't go any closer. Something about them felt off, like we weren't supposed to be there. I kept checking for movement in the windows, but saw nothing. We turned around and headed back the way we came. The walk back took longer somehow. Maybe because we were tired, or maybe because we kept checking behind us. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The silence didn't feel calm anymore. Felt watchful, like the forest had eyes. When we got back to the tent, we laid down again and rested. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees. Around dusk, we decided to try and make a fire. Neither of us had ever done it before. We had bought those self-lighting logs and a can of lighter fluid from a Walmart before the trip. The problem was, everything around us was soaked. The logs were wrapped in plastic so they were dry, but we needed something to get the fire to catch and stay lit. I gathered sticks, but most of them were soggy. Even the dry ones I found under thick logs or inside dead trees were barely enough. Took several tries, but eventually we got a small flame going. It sputtered and hissed from the moisture but held. We roasted hot dogs and marshmallows. The food tasted better than I expected. I think we were just hungry and tired. We sat on a log and watched the fire crackle. The sky turned dark quickly, the kind of dark where you can't see your hand unless it's right in front of your face. We had a couple of cheap flashlights, but even those felt weak. We looked up at the stars and talked for a while, mostly just sitting close and listening to the fire pop. Eventually, the fire started dying and the cold set in. We poured water on the remaining embers and crawled into the tent. Inside, it was warmer and we used our sleeping bags as padding. We left our shoes in the corner and lay down. First, it felt normal, the kind of tired comfort you get after a long day outside. But after a while, it became clear that she was tense. She kept shifting and breathing fast. I think she was more scared of the dark and the isolation than she let on. I closed my eyes and tried to relax. Then she grabbed my arm suddenly, hard. I opened my eyes, and she was already sitting up. I didn't even have time to say anything before I heard it. Footsteps, not light animal scurrying. These were heavy, measured, multiple. It sounded like several people walking just beyond the trees, circling. I froze. The sound of leaves and twigs crunching, slowly getting closer. And then mumbling, low, constant, almost rhythmic. Not loud enough to make out words, but loud enough to know it wasn't wind or an animal. It sounded like people talking under their breath. We didn't move. We just stared at each other. The sound of steps came closer and closer. The mumbling got louder. It moved around the tent in slow circles. Every once in a while, it would stop completely. That was the worst part, the pauses. You'd think it was gone, and then it would start again. A new set of footsteps. A new spot just outside the thin nylon wall of our tent. My breathing slowed without me realizing. I was holding my breath for minutes at a time. It was like every sound was magnified. Every time a leaf rustled, I thought something was about to happen. Then, complete silence.
No footsteps. No mumbling.
Not even wind. We waited. I don't know how long. Could have been 10 minutes. Could have been 30. She finally leaned toward me and gripped my shoulder. She wanted to go to the car. I knew she was right. We couldn't just sit there. So I slowly unzipped the tent, just a few inches. It was pitch black outside. The moon wasn't visible, and the clouds made sure of that. I stepped out first. My flashlight barely lit the path. I turned it in slow circles, scanning the trees. Nothing. I signaled her to follow. We ran. I don't even remember stepping over roots or rocks. It was like my legs moved on their own. We jumped into the car, slammed the doors, and locked them. The only light was the dashboard and our two pale faces reflected in the windshield. She looked panicked. I was still catching my breath. I kept looking out the windows, trying to see any sign of who or what had been outside. But there was nothing. It was like we imagined it. But we both knew we hadn't. It was too real, too specific, too loud. I told her to stay in the car and keep the doors locked. I got out, grabbed the cooler, and threw it into the back seat. I turned toward the tent to pack it up, and that's when I heard it again. Footsteps, this time faster, closer.
No mumbling.
Just the sound of someone or several people moving quickly through the brush. I didn't think. I yanked the tent up, poles and all. I wrapped the wet tarp around it and slung it over my shoulder like a bag of laundry. I didn't look behind me. I didn't pause. I dumped the tent in the trunk, slammed it shut, jumped into the car, and asked if everything was there. She said yes, and I floored it in reverse. The narrow road made it hard to move quickly. I kept checking the mirrors. I remember packing my old green backpack carefully, making sure I had everything for the weekend. The tent, sleeping bag, a few cans of food, water bottles, matches, a small camping stove, and a basic first aid kit. I didn't want to carry too much, but wanted to be ready for anything. It was early Friday morning when I finally got in my car and drove out of the city, heading for a remote camping spot I had found on a map. The plan was simple: escape the noise, get some fresh air, and spend a couple of nights alone in the woods. The road stretched ahead, winding through small towns and patches of forest. I could feel the excitement mixed with a little nervousness building up inside me. I wasn't used to camping alone. I'd gone with friends a few times, but never just by myself. The trees became thicker, and the air cooler as I drove further into the countryside. After about 2 hours, I turned off the main road onto a gravel path that looked narrow and rough. The car bounced over stones, the sound of tires crunching under the wheels echoing through the quiet. Eventually, I reached a small clearing by a river, the spot marked on my map. It was perfect. The river's water glistened under the afternoon sun, flowing calmly past tall pines and oaks. The smell of wet earth mixed with pine needles filled the air. I parked the car near a fallen log and began unpacking. Setting up the tent took longer than I expected, fumbling with poles and the rainfly, but I finally managed to get it standing straight. The opening faced the river so I could listen to the gentle flow while inside. The sun started lowering, casting long shadows through the trees. I gathered some dry wood and leaves for a fire. The forest was alive with sounds: the chirping of birds, rustling leaves, and the distant call of a crow. I struck the matches carefully, watching the small flame catch on the twigs. Soon, the fire grew steady, crackling and sending warm light flickering across the trees. I sat back on a rock, warming my hands, feeling the chill of evening slowly creeping in. I ate the canned beans and some crackers, drinking water straight from the bottle. The quiet was intense, not like the city's noise where there was always something happening. Here, it was just me and the woods. The sky turned dark, stars peeking through the branches. I felt a calm settle over me, almost like the world had paused. I stayed by the fire until it died down to glowing embers, then crawled inside my tent, zipped it shut, and lay down on my sleeping pad. The first night was strange. I could hear things moving outside, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. Sometimes I thought I heard footsteps, but when I looked out, nothing was there. My heart would jump, but then the silence returned. I reminded myself that it was just animals or the wind. Still, sleep came slowly. The tent felt small and closed, shadows moving in the dim light from my small flashlight. Morning came with a soft gray light filtering through the fabric. I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The river was calm, reflecting the overcast sky. I decided to take a walk along the bank. The ground was damp, soft with moss and fallen leaves. I noticed animal tracks in the mud: deer, raccoons, maybe a fox. The forest seemed different in daylight, less eerie, more alive. I collected some kindling and small branches to add to the fire pit and made breakfast: oatmeal with dried fruit. After eating, I explored further into the woods. The trees were tall and thick, their trunks rough under my hands. I found a narrow path, likely made by hikers or animals. The air smelled of pine resin and damp earth. Birds flitted through the canopy, their calls sharp and clear. As I walked, I kept an eye on the sky, knowing rain could come in at any time this time of year. I wasn't far from my campsite when I noticed something odd. A small, rusty metal sign nailed to a tree, half covered in moss. It was old, the letters faded and hard to read, but I could just make out the words, "private property." I paused. The map didn't show any private land here. I stepped back and looked around. The forest felt suddenly different, quieter, heavier. I didn't want to push my luck, so I turned back and made my way to the river. The thought of someone else nearby, watching or waiting, made me uneasy. Back at the camp, I sat by the fire and thought about what I had seen. Maybe this area wasn't as abandoned as I hoped. The afternoon passed with me reading from a small book I brought along and keeping the fire alive. Shadows grew longer, and the wind picked up, carrying a chill that made me pull my jacket tighter. The woods had a way of swallowing sound. Even the crackling of the fire seemed softer, swallowed by the trees. I decided to prepare a simple dinner: canned chili and some bread. The food was cold and bland but filling enough. As dusk fell, I started noticing more movement outside the camp. Not animals, but something else. Branches snapped at odd angles, and I saw glimpses of something moving just beyond the tree line. It wasn't fast, more like a slow, deliberate movement. I stayed close to the fire, keeping a stick nearby just in case. The feeling of being watched pressed down on me. I tried to stay calm and told myself I was imagining things. Night came again, darker and colder than before. I huddled inside the tent, listening to the sounds outside. The rustling got louder, closer. At one point, I heard a low, heavy breathing just beyond the fabric. My hands shook as I reached for my flashlight. I scanned the dark forest but saw only shadows. The fire outside was just a small patch of light through the trees. I realized I hadn't locked the car doors. Panic made me freeze for a moment. What if someone had followed me here? I forced myself to breathe slowly and think. The sensible thing was to stay quiet and wait until morning. If there was someone out there, showing fear might make things worse. I gripped the stick tighter and tried to settle my mind. Eventually, the sounds faded and I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke early, heart pounding. I packed up most of my things quickly, making sure not to leave anything behind. The forest was silent except for birds and the river's soft murmur. I kept my eyes peeled as I walked to the car. When I reached it, the doors were locked and everything inside was untouched. Relief washed over me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there with me. Close enough to touch, but unseen. I didn't linger. I started the engine and drove away from the clearing, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. The trip back was quiet, my mind replaying every sound, every shadow from the night before. When I reached the main road, the sun was high and warm. The city noise felt harsh but safe. I promised myself I would never camp alone in a place I didn't know again. That weekend in the woods taught me more than I expected. Nature is beautiful and peaceful, but it can also be unpredictable and unforgiving. And sometimes, the scariest things are not ghosts or monsters, but the real, quiet dangers lurking just beyond the firelight. I still go camping, but always with a friend now. And I always make sure I know exactly where I am, who owns the land, and how to get help if I need it. Because being alone out there, with only the trees and shadows, is not something I want to face again without backup. The summer I spent that weekend camping in the North Georgia mountains is one I still think about, especially when I'm alone at night. It wasn't the kind of trip I planned carefully or dreamed about for months. It was more like a last-minute decision to escape the noise of the city, to breathe fresh air, and to feel like I was somewhere wild again. I didn't expect much, just some quiet, nature, and maybe a little adventure. But what I got was something more complicated, more unsettling, and harder to shake off than I ever thought possible. I left Friday afternoon, driving up the winding roads toward the Chattahoochee National Forest. The sky was a clear blue with a few lazy clouds drifting by. The heat pressed down on my car as I rolled the windows down, letting in the smell of pine and dry earth. The roads were narrow and twisting, lined with tall trees that seemed to lean over the asphalt like silent guards. I had my small tent, a sleeping bag, a cooler with food, and some basic camping gear. Nothing fancy, just what I thought I'd need for a quiet night or two. By the time I reached the small town closest to my campsite, the sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. The town itself was tiny, just a few shops, a gas station, and something that looked like a bar or a restaurant. It was one of those places where the buildings seemed old, worn down by time and weather, but still standing stubbornly. I stopped at the gas station to fill my tank and grab a couple of bottles of water. The clerk was a quiet guy, maybe in his late 40s, with a weathered face and tired eyes. He didn't say much beyond the basics, but he did warn me that the area I was heading to was dry. No alcohol sales allowed in the county. That was something I didn't know. I nodded, thanked him, and headed back to my car. As I drove out of town, the streetlights faded away, replaced by the deepening darkness of the forest. The road got rougher, dirtier, with patches of gravel and potholes that made me slow down. After about 15 more minutes, I saw a small clearing on the side of the road where a few tents were already set up. This was the spot I'd picked, the trailhead for a popular hiking path, but quiet and isolated enough to feel private. I parked, unloaded my gear, and started setting up my tent. The air was cool now, a sharp change from the day's heat. Crickets chirped all around, and the scent of damp leaves and wood smoke drifted in the breeze. As I hammered the stakes into the ground and pulled the rainfly over the tent, I noticed a faint light flickering a little ways down the road. A soft, warm glow that didn't belong to any of the campers nearby. Curious, I walked toward it, my flashlight beam cutting through the dark. The light came from an old, wooden building with a faded sign hanging above the door. The letters were worn, but I could just make out the word bar. What surprised me was that this was supposed to be a dry county. No alcohol sold legally anywhere nearby. The building looked abandoned, with peeling paint and broken windows. But the light was real, and there was the low murmur of voices coming from inside. I stood outside for a moment, the wind rustling the leaves overhead. The soft buzz of insects and the distant call of an owl made the scene feel oddly alive despite the building's rundown appearance. I couldn't see anyone clearly through the windows, just shadows moving. I thought maybe it was some kind of private gathering or a hidden party that locals threw once in a while. As I turned back toward my campsite, a strange feeling crept over me. It wasn't fear exactly, but a deep sense that something wasn't quite right. The air felt heavier, and the sounds of the forest seemed to fade away, replaced by a tense silence. I shook it off, telling myself I was just tired from the drive. Back at my tent, I cooked a simple meal on my portable stove, some canned beans, bread, and a few slices of cheese. The fire crackled softly, sending shadows dancing across the trees. I sat on a log nearby, staring up at the stars that blazed clearly in the night sky. It was peaceful, beautiful even, but the feeling from before lingered. Around midnight, I heard footsteps on the dirt road nearby, slow and steady. They stopped not far from my tent, then moved on. I thought maybe one of the other campers was out for a walk. But when I looked toward the faint glow from the bar, the lights inside had gone out. The building was dark and silent again. Strange, I thought. The voices, the light, they were gone as if they never existed. I tried to sleep, but the silence around me was thick and unnatural. I could hear my own breathing, the occasional snap of a twig, and the distant call of an animal I couldn't identify. Every time I closed my eyes, the memory of that strange bar flashed in my mind. The flickering light, the muffled voices, the shadows behind the windows. I wondered who had been inside and why it had suddenly vanished. Morning came slowly, pale sunlight filtering through the trees. The forest was alive with birdsong and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I packed up my tent, eager to leave the uneasy night behind. On my way back to the car, I decided to stop by the spot where I'd seen the bar. But there was nothing. No building, no light, no sign that anything had been there the night before. Just trees and dirt road like it was a normal stretch of forest road. I walked up and down the area carefully, looking for any sign of a foundation, a path, or even footprints. Nothing. It was like the bar had disappeared completely. Puzzled, I drove back to the small town to ask around. At the gas station, I tried to mention the building, but the clerk just looked at me blankly. When I described it, he shook his head slowly and said there had never been a bar on that road. The closest one was miles away, in a neighboring county. I didn't push further. There was no point. I paid for some snacks and headed home, feeling a mix of relief and confusion. In the days after, I thought a lot about that weekend. Maybe I'd seen things wrong. Maybe my tired mind had played tricks on me, but something about it felt too real. The light, the voices, the strange footsteps in the night. It wasn't a dream or a hallucination. Eventually, I realized that some places hold secrets, places where people come and go in shadows. The bar in that dry county wasn't on any map, and no one talked about it openly. Maybe it was a hidden spot for locals to gather away from the law, or maybe it was something else entirely. Whatever it was, I didn't return. I left the mountains behind and went back to my normal life. But every now and then, when the night is quiet and the wind blows just right, I think about that flickering light in the woods, and I wonder if it's still there, waiting for someone else to find it. The sun was dipping low behind the thick trees as I drove deeper into the forest. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. I had planned this camping trip for months. A solo weekend in a remote part of the state I had never been to before. I needed time to clear my head, away from the noise of the city and the endless distractions. I wanted silence, nature, and a chance to be completely alone with my thoughts. The road had narrowed to a dirt path littered with rocks and fallen branches. My truck bounced with every bump, but I didn't mind. The radio was off, the windows rolled down, and I could hear the steady hum of insects and birds settling down for the night. I parked near a small clearing I had found marked on the old map I'd bought weeks ago. No other cars were in sight, just the thick forest standing tall around the clearing like silent guardians. I unloaded my gear carefully: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and my small camping stove. I set up the tent on flat ground where the grass was short and the earth firm. The sound of twigs snapping under my boots and the rustle of leaves made me aware of every movement around me. The forest felt alive, but it was calm, nothing too out of the ordinary. I built a small fire ring out of stones I found nearby, careful to clear the area of dry leaves and pine needles. Lighting the fire was easy with the dry wood, and soon flames danced, casting shadows that flickered across the trees. I sat by the fire, letting the warmth seep into my skin, watching the sky turn dark and the stars begin to peek out between the branches overhead. The silence was comforting. As night deepened, the sounds of the forest changed. Crickets chirped rhythmically, owls called in the distance, and occasionally, a branch would snap far off in the woods. I reminded myself these were just the natural sounds of a forest at night. I had done this before, camped alone in the wilderness, and nothing felt unusual yet. I prepared a simple dinner: canned beans warmed over the fire and a granola bar for dessert. The food tasted better out here, away from the convenience of stores and fast food. I took my time eating, sitting quietly, watching the fire crackle, feeling the cool night air brush my face. Once I finished, I cleaned up thoroughly, making sure no scraps were left that could attract animals. I crawled into my sleeping bag inside the tent. The fabric rustled softly as I settled in, and I zipped the door shut tightly. I was miles away from the nearest house, the only light coming from my small lantern. The darkness beyond the tent walls felt dense, pressing close, but I welcomed it. The forest didn't stay silent for long. Not long after I lay down, I heard something: soft footsteps outside the tent. Not the usual animal noises, but heavier, deliberate. My heart beat faster, but I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon. Still, the footsteps stopped right outside my tent for what felt like several minutes. I didn't move, barely breathing, waiting for the sounds to go away. Eventually, the footsteps faded back into the forest, leaving a ringing silence. I couldn't sleep, listening for any other sounds. The night stretched on, cold and still. Around 2 a.m., the wind picked up suddenly, shaking the tent and whistling through the trees. I zipped the tent tighter, pulling my sleeping bag closer. Then I heard a faint rustling coming from the edge of the clearing, near where I had left my fire ring. It sounded like someone or something dragging across the dry leaves and dirt. I sat up, heart pounding. I stared into the darkness beyond the mesh window, but I couldn't see anything. The rustling stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so thick I could hear my own breathing. I waited for a long time, but nothing came. After what felt like hours, I drifted back to restless sleep. Morning came slow and gray. The sun peeked weakly through thick clouds, and I packed up my gear, still unsettled. As I walked to the spot where my fire had been, I noticed something strange. The fire ring stones were scattered, not just moved by the wind or an animal, but thrown haphazardly around the clearing. The ground near the ring was disturbed, as if something heavy had been dragged through the dirt and leaves. I felt a cold chill crawl up my spine. I scanned the area carefully. Small footprints surrounded the clearing, too big for any deer, too human-like to be an animal. I crouched down to look closer. The prints were messy, overlapping, some barely visible. Whoever or whatever had been here moved quickly or was careless. I packed up faster now, anxiety gnawing at my gut. My plan had been to stay another night, but something about this place felt off. I loaded my things into the truck, ready to leave. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the clearing one last time. That's when I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the tree line. Tall, still, watching. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark shape. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to believe it was a trick of the light or a tree shaped by shadows, but it stood too still, too deliberate. I slammed the door shut, eyes fixed on the figure. Then it disappeared behind the trees. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I drove fast down the dirt path, heart pounding, checking the rearview mirror constantly for any sign of movement behind me. The road seemed longer and darker, every shadow now threatening. When I finally reached the paved highway, I felt some relief, but I kept looking back over my shoulder until the forest was far behind me. Back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me that night, waiting for me to be alone. The stones moved in the fire ring, the strange footprints, and the figure standing just beyond the trees were all real. Not ghosts, not stories. Something very human and very dangerous. I reported the strange footprints and the possible trespassing to the park rangers, hoping someone else would investigate. They said the area was known for illegal hunting and trespassers, but nothing violent. Still, I didn't go back. That weekend taught me that some places in the wild aren't as empty as we think. The forest holds its own secrets, and some of them are better left alone. The silence at night can be broken by more than just animals. Knowing that changed how I see camping now, and how careful I have to be when I choose to disappear into the woods. The memory of that figure standing in the dark remains clear in my mind, a reminder that sometimes the scariest things are the ones with no explanation, just a shadow watching from the edge of the trees, waiting silently in the night. The sun had just begun to set when I pulled off the narrow road and into the gravel parking area beside the small clearing. The spot was tucked deep in the woods of a state park I'd never been to before, somewhere far enough from the city that the night promised to be truly dark. The air was cool and carried the scent of pine and damp earth, the smell I always found comforting and a little thrilling when I was out camping. I had planned this weekend alone, away from everyone and everything familiar. No distractions, no noise but the forest itself. Just me, my gear, and the wild. I parked the car, grabbed my backpack, and walked down the worn path to the clearing. The place was perfect. Flat, with soft grass and enough room to pitch a tent without cutting down any branches. Around the clearing, tall trees formed a thick wall of green. Their leaves rustled quietly in the evening breeze, and the fading sunlight made their trunks glow a warm orange. Felt peaceful here, untouched. Setting up camp was the usual routine. I unpacked my tent, spread the tarp under it to keep moisture out, and hammered the stakes into the ground one by one. My hands moved automatically, practiced from years of camping, but my eyes kept scanning the shadows at the edge of the clearing. Sometimes the woods seemed to hold their breath just before night falls. I brushed the feeling off. It was nothing but nerves. Once the tent was up, I gathered some dry wood for a fire. The forest floor was littered with fallen branches, broken twigs, and pine needles. It took a while to find the right pieces, dry enough to catch fire, not too big to smother the flames. I stacked the wood carefully, making a small pyramid near the fire pit carved into the dirt. I found some kindling and leaves to help the fire start, then used my lighter to spark a flame. The fire caught quickly, flames licking upward and throwing flickering shadows across the clearing. I sat on a small log near the fire, pulling out a simple dinner, canned beans and bread heated slowly over the flames. The crackling of the fire, the distant call of a bird settling in for the night, and the gentle rustle of leaves were the only sounds. It was quiet, but not empty. The forest felt alive in a way the city never does. As night deepened, I crawled into the tent to get ready for bed. The tent fabric glowed faintly in the firelight, casting red shadows inside. I unrolled my sleeping bag, changed into warmer clothes, and checked my flashlight and phone. The signal was weak here, barely enough for a text or two. Perfect. I wanted no distractions. Lying on my back, staring at the tent ceiling, I listened. The sounds of the forest at night are different. Owls hooting, small animals rustling through leaves, the wind moving through the branches. Felt like the world had slowed. Everything softened. My mind started to drift, but the calm didn't last long. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. It wasn't a noise at first, just a feeling, like something was wrong. My heart was pounding as I reached for my flashlight. The beam sliced through the darkness of the tent. I listened closely. There was a faint sound, something dragging or scraping, just outside the clearing, near the trees. I stayed still for a few minutes, trying to tell if it was an animal or maybe just the wind. The noise stopped. I thought maybe I'd imagined it. I told myself it was probably a deer or some raccoon looking for food, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there watching. The rest of the night was uneasy. Every small sound made me jump. The wind howled a little, and I kept thinking I saw shapes moving just beyond the light of the fire. But when I shined the flashlight out, there was nothing. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, dark and full of secrets. When dawn came, I was relieved. The first pale light seeped through the tent fabric, and the world outside looked safe again. I packed up slowly, eyes flicking nervously toward the trees as I dismantled the tent and loaded my gear back into the car. Nothing had moved while I packed, but the tension from the night hadn't fully left me. Driving away, the sunlight warmed the windshield, and the forest shrank behind me. The woods had felt alive in a way I didn't understand, but I knew I'd never forget how real and raw it had been. The weekend was supposed to be a quiet escape, but it became a reminder that the wild is full of things we don't always see or hear clearly, and sometimes that's enough to make the night feel very, very long. The road stretched out ahead, winding through thick woods that seemed to hold the quiet secrets of the forest. I had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. A chance to get away from the city noise, the endless buzz of screens and calls. Just me, the trees, and a few essentials packed in my backpack. I chose a small campsite in the mountains of northern Georgia, where the air promised to be cool and the stars bright. As I drove up the narrow road, the tall pines crowded close, casting long shadows even in the late afternoon sun. The scent of pine needles mixed with damp earth filled the air. I had been here once before with friends, but this time I was alone. Part of me liked the quiet, the chance to hear my own thoughts without interruption. Pulling into the campsite, I noticed it was nearly empty. A few tents were pitched here and there, but no one was around. The small wooden kiosk where campers usually signed in was locked, and no rangers were in sight. I shrugged and grabbed my pack, heading toward the cleared area beside the small creek that babbled nearby. The spot looked perfect. Flat ground, some dead wood for fire, and a view of the rising sun behind the distant hills. I unpacked slowly, setting up my tent carefully. I like to make my sleeping spot comfortable, spreading out the sleeping pad, laying the sleeping bag just right, and arranging my small lantern within reach. The sun was dipping low now, and the forest began to darken quickly. Shadows deepened among the trees, and the soft sounds of birds settling for the night drifted through the air. After setting up, I gathered wood for a fire. I chose pieces that were dry and crackly, stacking them neatly beside the pit ringed with stones. Lighting a fire is always a ritual for me. The spark catching, the flame growing, the warmth spreading into the chilly evening air. It felt like a small victory against the coming night. The fire's orange glow danced across the nearby trees as I sat back on a log, eating a simple dinner of canned beans and crackers. The stars were starting to appear, pinpricks of light in the darkening sky. I breathed deeply, savoring the stillness. The only sounds were the crackling fire, the soft rush of the creek, and the occasional rustle of a small animal in the brush. As darkness settled in, I double-checked my tent zipper, the flashlight batteries, and my phone's GPS tracker. I never trusted the wilderness completely, but I had done this before and knew the basic safety rules. Still, a small part of me always stayed alert, watching shadows that moved just at the edge of my vision. Around 10 p.m., I felt the chill creep in deeper. The fire was dying down, and I tossed a few more sticks on it before crawling into my sleeping bag. The night noises took on a sharper tone. An owl hooted far off, branches scraped against each other in the wind, and every so often, a distant howl echoed. Not wolves, I thought, probably coyotes. The sound made me feel small and far from home, but strangely alive. Sleep didn't come easily. The dark seemed heavy, and every tiny noise caught my attention. My mind kept drifting back to a feeling I couldn't quite shake, a sensation like I was being watched. I scanned the trees through the tent mesh, but saw nothing. I told myself it was just nerves, that the forest was alive with animals moving around. Suddenly, a sharp crack broke the quiet. It wasn't far away, maybe just beyond the creek. My heart jumped, and I froze. Could have been a branch breaking, an animal, anything. But the sound repeated, softer this time. Something was definitely moving near my camp. I grabbed my flashlight, flicked it on, and shone it into the darkness. The beam cut through the black, lighting up trunks and leaves, but nothing moved in the circle. I sat still for a long time, listening. The woods felt too quiet now, as if whatever had made the sound had stopped. Waiting. I debated packing up and leaving, but the thought of moving through the forest in total dark without a clear path made me stay put. I rolled over and tried to force myself to relax, telling myself it was nothing, probably just a deer or raccoon. But then, there was a whisper of movement on the other side of the creek. Something heavier than an animal, I thought. The sound of footsteps crunching dry leaves. Slow, careful, deliberate. My flashlight flicked toward the noise again, and this time I caught a glimpse of something. Just a shape moving behind the trees, barely visible. I didn't know what to do. My phone had no signal, and I was miles from the nearest road. The idea of shouting for help felt useless in the vast forest. My breathing quickened. I reached into my pack and pulled out my pocket knife, just in case. The cold sweat on my forehead told me I was scared. Minutes stretched on like hours. The footsteps stopped. Silence fell again, thick and heavy. I held the knife tight and waited until the first signs of dawn. When the light finally crept back through the trees, the forest looked peaceful again, almost as if nothing had disturbed it. I poked at the fire pit, the embers still warm, and started packing quickly. I didn't want to stay another night. On my way out, as I passed a small dirt trail leading deeper into the woods, I noticed something strange. A small piece of torn fabric snagged on a branch, dirt-stained and rough. It wasn't mine, and I had no idea how it got there. I pocketed it and kept walking faster. The drive back to town was tense. My mind kept replaying every sound, every shadow. When I finally reached the highway, the lights and noise felt like a strange kind of safety. Back home, I cleaned my gear and looked again at the fabric scrap. It was from a heavy jacket, worn and stained. I put it away and told myself the forest had been playing tricks on me, that I was overthinking everything. Days later, I read the local news. A man had gone missing about a week before my trip, last seen near that very campsite. The article said he was wearing a jacket just like the scrap I found. Police suspected foul play, but no arrests had been made. They urged hikers to be careful in the area. That was enough for me. I never went back to that part of the woods. The forest kept its secrets, but I knew some things were better left alone. I learned that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters, but the unknown people who hide in the shadows, waiting. In the end, the trip gave me a clear lesson. The wilderness is beautiful, but can be dangerous in ways you don't expect. Trust your instincts, always be prepared, and remember that sometimes the quietest nights are the ones that demand your fullest attention. The sun was just beginning to set when I reached the small clearing that would be my campsite for the weekend. I had driven deep into the forest, far from any city lights or noise, hoping for a peaceful escape. The tall pine trees towered over me, their needles rustling softly in the early evening breeze. The air smelled sharp and fresh, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and pine resin. I could hear birds calling to one another, and somewhere nearby, a stream babbled quietly over rocks. I parked my car on a narrow dirt path that ended just before the clearing. I grabbed my backpack and the camping gear from the trunk, careful to keep the sound as low as possible to not disturb the wildlife. My plan was simple: set up the tent, gather some firewood, cook a simple meal, and then settle in for a quiet night under the stars. I was looking forward to a weekend without distractions. No phone, no internet, just me and the woods. Setting up the tent took longer than I expected. The ground was uneven and covered in fallen needles and small twigs, which made it hard to find a flat spot. I finally settled on a place near the edge of the clearing, where the ground sloped gently toward the trees. The canvas of the tent felt rough under my hands as I hammered the stakes into the ground. The zipper slid smoothly as I finished assembling the frame. With the tent ready, I turned my attention to gathering firewood. The forest floor was littered with branches and dead wood, but most of it was damp from an earlier rain. I searched carefully for dry pieces, pulling small twigs and larger branches from under piles of leaves. The process was slow, and I could feel the chill starting to settle as the sun disappeared behind the trees. Shadows stretched long across the clearing, and the birds' songs began to fade. The forest was changing from a lively, sunlit place to something quieter, darker. I found a small rock ring left by previous campers and began building the fire inside it. It took some effort to arrange the twigs just right to catch the spark from my lighter. After several attempts, the flames finally caught and started to grow. The warmth was immediate and comforting. I sat close, letting the firelight push back the encroaching darkness. The crackling would fill the quiet, steady and sure. Next, I prepared a simple meal, just canned beans heated in a small pot over the fire. The steam rose up in soft clouds, mixing with the wood smoke. The smell was earthy and familiar, a reminder of simpler times and quiet evenings spent outdoors. As I ate, I kept my eyes on the tree line, watching for movement. So far, nothing stirred beyond the normal night sounds. An owl hooting somewhere far off, the rustle of small animals in the brush. After eating, I cleaned up carefully, making sure no scraps were left behind to attract unwanted visitors. Bears were not common in this area, but I didn't want to take any chances. I packed everything into sealed bags and hung them from a high branch a good distance from the tent. The forest felt peaceful again, but there was a stillness now that was different from before. It was a quiet that felt too heavy, as if something was watching. I lay back in my sleeping bag inside the tent, the nylon walls glowing faintly orange from the dying fire outside. I listened to the forest's night sounds, the wind moving through the branches, the distant call of an animal I couldn't identify, the steady drip of moisture falling from leaves. Then, I heard a new noise, soft and deliberate. It was a crunching sound, like footsteps stepping carefully on dry leaves and twigs. My heart quickened. I stayed still and quiet, straining to hear more. The footsteps came closer, slow and careful, pausing at times as if the person was trying not to be heard. I reached for the small flashlight I had left within arm's reach but stopped myself. If whoever it was saw the light, they might think I was a threat or invite confrontation. The footsteps moved around the edge of the clearing, circling near my campsite but never coming into the firelight. I remembered the knife tucked in my backpack, just in case, and felt it reassuringly cold in my hand. I stayed as quiet as I could, every muscle tense. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and then I heard breathing, not heavy, but slow and calm, as if the person was standing still, listening. Time stretched out, every second feeling much longer than it should. Then the footsteps turned and moved away, retreating into the dark woods. I didn't dare move until I was sure the person had gone. When I finally felt safe enough to leave the tent, I extinguished the fire completely, smothering the embers with dirt and water. The forest was pitch black without the fire, and I used my flashlight to scan the area. No signs of anyone, no footprints, no gear left behind. Just the usual patterns of leaves and broken branches. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening and watching, but nothing else came. When dawn broke, the forest transformed again. Light filtered through the trees, and the sounds of morning animals filled the air. I felt a little safer in the daylight, but the memory of the night's visitor lingered. I packed up my campsite slowly, taking extra care to leave no trace. The forest seemed welcoming again, peaceful like it was before I arrived. As I walked back toward my car, the crunch of my boots on the dirt trail felt steady and certain. The woods were beautiful, wild, and full of life, but I knew I had been lucky to avoid trouble. When I reached my car, I checked my phone signal for the first time since arriving. There were a few missed calls and messages from family checking in. I called back, feeling relief in hearing familiar voices. It was good to know I was safe and connected again. Driving away from the forest, I looked back at the trees disappearing behind me. The experience left me with a deep respect for the wilderness, its quiet beauty and its dangers. Camping alone was peaceful, but it also required vigilance and care. I promised myself that next time I would bring a companion and be even more prepared. The forest had tested me, and I had come through with a clear mind and safe body. That weekend stayed with me, a reminder that nature is never predictable, and sometimes the scariest things are the ones you don't see, only feel. The sun had barely touched the tops of the trees when I arrived at the cabin. It was early fall, and the air held that crispness that promised cold nights and clear skies. The gravel road leading to the cabin was narrow and winding, lined by tall pines and maples already blushing with their autumn colors. I parked my old truck at the edge of a small clearing and took a moment to breathe in the quiet. No cars, no voices, just the wind moving through the leaves and the distant call of a lone crow. The cabin itself was simple, made of rough-hewn logs stacked thick and strong. It looked like it had been built decades ago, but still solid, with a stone chimney rising on one side. The front porch creaked softly under my boots as I walked up, the wooden boards weathered and worn but still sturdy. I could smell the faint scent of pine sap and something older, musty wood, the scent of a place that had seen many seasons. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cabin was dim, lit only by the pale morning light filtering through small, dusty windows. The floor was rough planks, cool beneath my feet. I flicked on the small electric lantern on the counter, casting long shadows that made the room seem bigger and emptier than it really was. There was a fireplace built of river stones, cold and unused now. Against one wall stood a small kitchen area, simple shelves, a cast iron stove, a chipped enamel sink. A table with two mismatched chairs sat near the window, and an old couch covered in faded fabric took up one corner. I set my pack down and started unpacking. I had come here for a week alone, looking to escape the noise of the city and the constant pull of my phone and computer. Just me, the cabin, and the woods. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just some quiet and space to think. Outside, the forest stretched deep and wild. The trees stood tall and straight, their trunks thick with moss and lichen. Fallen leaves carpeted the ground, crackling softly underfoot when I stepped outside to gather firewood. I found a pile of dry branches near the back of the cabin, enough to last for several nights if I kept the fire small. The smell of burning wood mixed with the fresh earth and pine filled the air as I lit the stove and prepared a simple meal. That first evening passed without much more than the usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of squirrels, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional snap of a twig. I settled by the fire, reading a worn paperback I'd brought along, feeling the warmth seep into my bones as the shadows danced on the walls. The next day, I decided to explore the area. There was a small dirt path behind the cabin, leading deeper into the woods. It wasn't marked on any map I had, but I figured I could follow it until it ended or I got tired. The forest was thick, and sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden beams. The smell of damp earth and fallen leaves was strong, and I noticed small animal tracks in the mud, raccoons or maybe foxes. I walked for a couple of hours, taking care not to disturb the quiet. The deeper I went, the more I realized how isolated the place was. There were no other cabins or signs of human life for miles, just the endless green and brown of the forest. When I returned, I noticed something odd near the cabin. A few branches were broken off low on a nearby tree, as if someone or something had brushed past. At first, I thought it might have been a deer or a bear, but the brakes were sharp and clean, like they'd been snapped by human hands or claws. I shrugged it off and went inside. That night, as I lay on the couch listening to the wind, I heard a noise outside. It was faint at first, like a soft scrape against the wood of the cabin. I froze, heart beating a little faster. The sound came again, slow and deliberate. Something was moving just beyond the window. I didn't move or make a sound. After a moment, the noise stopped. I waited a while longer before finally convincing myself it was just a branch or a small animal. The next morning, I found more evidence outside. Near the side of the cabin, footprints were pressed into the soft dirt. They weren't large, maybe size 9 or 10, and definitely human. They led around the back and then disappeared into the trees. I felt a chill but told myself it could be another camper or a hiker. Still, the feeling of being watched had settled over me like a heavy blanket. I started taking precautions. I kept the fire going during the day, making smoke and light, hoping it would discourage anyone from coming near. I also found a thick branch outside to keep nearby if needed. The following days passed with increasing tension. Every evening brought new sounds, soft footsteps crunching leaves, the snap of a twig just outside the window, shadows flitting between the trees. I stopped exploring far from the cabin and kept the doors locked tight. One afternoon, I spotted something in the distance, a figure standing just at the edge of the tree line, watching. When I noticed it, the figure disappeared quickly into the woods. I didn't see any face, only a dark shape that moved with purpose. The sight shook me. I had no phone signal out here and no way to call for help if needed. That night, I barely slept. Every creak and rustle put me on edge. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps on the porch, slow and careful. I grabbed the branch I'd found and sat up, listening. Nothing else came. The next morning, I found a note slipped under the door. The paper was torn from a notebook, and the words were hastily scrawled in pencil. "Leave. Now, this place is not safe." My hands trembled as I held the note. Who had left it? Why? I was alone here, at least I thought so. I debated leaving immediately, but something held me back. Maybe it was stubbornness, or the desire to prove to myself that I could handle being alone. I packed a small bag with essentials and planned to leave at first light the next day. But that night, the noises escalated. Heavy footsteps stomped near the cabin. The sound of something banging against the walls. I pressed myself against the door, clutching the branch, waiting for whatever was outside to reveal itself. At dawn, when the first light broke through the trees, the noise stopped. The forest was quiet again. I stepped outside cautiously. The ground was disturbed. Tracks circled the cabin, some large, some small. I saw broken branches, marks on the walls, and an overturned chair on the porch. I didn't hesitate anymore. I grabbed my bag, locked the door behind me, and started walking toward the truck. The forest felt different, heavier somehow, and I kept looking over my shoulder. The walk back to the truck felt longer than before. Every shadow seemed alive. When I finally reached the gravel road, relief flooded through me. I started the engine and drove away, the cabin disappearing behind me like a bad memory. As I left the forest behind, I realized something important. The fear and unease I felt weren't from ghosts or stories. It was something more real, people. Someone else had been there, watching, maybe waiting. That knowledge stayed with me long after I was safe. A reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't made up. They're just out there, in the quiet woods, waiting for someone to come too close. From then on, I never went back to that cabin or any place so isolated without telling someone exactly where I was going. And I never ignored the feeling that sometimes it's better to listen when something tells you to leave. Because survival isn't about courage alone. It's about knowing when to walk away. The old cabin sat deep in the woods, far enough from the nearest road to feel completely cut off from the world. It was the kind of place I had avoided my whole life, but something made me decide to spend a weekend there. The idea was simple. Get away from everything. No phone, no internet, no city noise. Just me and the forest. I thought it would be peaceful, maybe even refreshing. I was wrong. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was already dipping behind the tall trees, casting long shadows over the gravel driveway. The cabin was nothing fancy. Rough wood siding weathered by years of rain and wind, a small porch with a sagging roof, and windows that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in months. I parked my car next to the porch and took a deep breath of the cold, pine-scented air. The smell was sharp and fresh, but it also carried a hint of dampness that made my skin crawl. Inside, the cabin was dim but clean. Dust floated in the slanting sunlight through the grimy windows, landing on cracked floorboards and old furniture covered with faded blankets. The kitchen was small, with a rusted sink and a gas stove that looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. There was a single, narrow hallway leading to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. The walls were thin, and the wood creaked with every step. I dropped my backpack by the door and opened the windows to let in some fresh air. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birdsong, no rustling animals. Just the heavy silence of late autumn, like the woods were holding their breath. Outside, the trees stood tall and close, their branches tangled like fingers reaching toward the sky. I decided to set up the fire before dark, so I grabbed some dry wood stacked near the porch and brought it inside. As I started the fire, the cabin grew warmer and the shadows on the walls flickered. The only sound was the crackling of the flames and the occasional pop from the burning logs. I sat down on an old armchair near the fireplace and took out a notebook, thinking I'd write down my thoughts or maybe sketch the view outside. But my hand trembled slightly, and my eyes kept darting to the window, watching the forest edge where the darkness seemed to thicken. I tried to ignore the feeling of being watched. It was stupid, I told myself. I was alone, and the forest was empty. But the air felt heavy, like something was just beyond sight. I closed the notebook and leaned back, listening. There was a faint noise, soft scraping, coming from outside, near the porch. I froze, waiting. The sound stopped. I forced myself to stand and walk outside, flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the dark, lighting up the leaves and the rough bark of the trees. The ground was soft with fallen leaves and pine needles. I looked around but saw nothing out of place. No footprints, no broken branches. Just the usual mess of nature settling into the night. I went back inside, locked the door, and drew the curtains. The fire was dying down, and I added more wood, trying to keep the cabin warm. The cold outside was biting through the cracks in the walls, making the temperature drop fast. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and sat close to the fire again. Night fell completely, and the forest became a black wall outside the windows. I tried to focus on the fire and the feeling of safety it gave me, but my mind kept wandering back to that sound. Then I heard it again, the scraping, this time softer but closer, like something was brushing against the porch railing. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. There, just beyond the glass, I saw a shadow move. It wasn't human, not exactly. Too big and low to the ground. Maybe a deer or a bear, but the shape was wrong, too stiff, too deliberate. Stayed still, then vanished behind the trees. My heart pounded. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly opened the door. The cold air hit me, sharp and wet with the smell of moss and earth. I scanned the area, but there was no sign of the figure. I checked behind the porch, around the sides, but only found broken twigs and scattered leaves. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak and groan of the cabin made me jump. The wind picked up, rattling the windows and whistling through the cracks. I sat by the fire until it burned out, then wrapped myself in blankets on the old sofa. The darkness felt alive, pressing in on me, but I kept my eyes open. The next day, I decided to explore the woods. I packed some water and snacks and left the cabin behind, telling myself the daylight would clear my head. The forest was thick with trees and bushes, the ground soft underfoot. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, making patches of gold on the mossy floor. I walked for hours, following animal trails and crossing small streams. The forest felt calm, almost welcoming in the daylight. I found a clearing with wildflowers and sat down to rest. The quiet was soothing, and I let myself relax for a moment. That's when I noticed the footprints. They weren't deer or bear tracks. These were large and flat, too big for any animal around here. They looked human. The prints were fresh, pressed deeply into the soft earth, leading back toward the cabin. My stomach twisted. I followed the trail quickly, heart racing. The trees grew closer together, blocking the sunlight. Soon, I was back near the cabin. The prints circled around it, disappeared near the porch, then vanished into the woods again. Whoever had made them had been close all along. Back inside, I checked the windows and doors again. Nothing was broken, no sign of forced entry. But the footprints told a different story. Someone had been here near me watching. The thought made the cabin feel smaller, suffocating. That night, I kept the fire roaring and the door locked tight. I sat in the chair by the flames, my eyes never leaving the windows. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was just outside, waiting. In the early hours, I heard it again. Soft footsteps on the porch. Slow, careful, as if whoever it was didn't want to be heard. I grabbed the flashlight and peered through the curtains. The porch was empty, but then I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the trees. No face, just a dark silhouette. Didn't move, didn't blink. It just watched. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours. When the sky finally lightened with dawn, the figure was gone. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I packed my things quickly, my hands shaking. Before leaving, I took one last look at the cabin. It stood quiet and empty, but the shadows under the porch seemed darker than before. The forest was alive again, but it felt different, like it had a secret it wasn't telling. I drove away without looking back. The silence on the road felt like a relief, like I had left something dangerous behind. The cabin stayed there in the woods, waiting for the next person foolish enough to stay the night. And me, I never went back. But sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear footsteps outside my window. The cabin stood deep in the woods, far enough from the nearest town that cell phones were useless and the road disappeared into dirt and gravel miles back. I had chosen this place to get away, to be alone with the quiet, and to reset after months of stress and endless noise in the city. The cabin wasn't fancy, just a simple wooden structure with a small porch, a stone fireplace, and a few windows overlooking the thick forest. I'd rented it for a week, planning to spend my days hiking and evenings by the fire, reading or just staring at the dark woods. The first day was peaceful. I arrived around noon, carrying a backpack with all I thought I'd need: food, water, clothes, a few books, and some camping gear. The sun was bright and warm, and the forest around the cabin looked inviting, alive with birdsong and rustling leaves. I unpacked slowly, setting the small things on the kitchen counter and hanging clothes on hooks by the door. Outside, the wind played with the tall pines and maples, and I could hear a distant creek flowing somewhere nearby. That night, the silence pressed in around me. No hum of cars, no chatter of people. Just the occasional call of an owl or the snap of a twig outside. The darkness felt thick and close, like the woods themselves were watching. I made a fire in the stone fireplace, watching the flames flicker and dance. The cabin felt safe, and I reminded myself I was prepared. Still, the quiet was heavier than I expected. On the second day, I decided to explore more of the area. The rental included a trail map, and I set out early, hiking deeper into the forest. The trail wound through dense trees, over roots and rocks, and sometimes alongside the creek I had heard. The air was cool and fresh, and the only sounds were my footsteps and the occasional bird. I kept my phone off, wanting no distractions. As the hours passed, I felt more relaxed. The forest was calming, almost like it had a rhythm I could fall into. But as the day wore on, I noticed something strange. I kept seeing broken branches and disturbed underbrush, as if something large had moved through recently. There were no animal tracks, at least none I could recognize, only odd marks that looked like claws or maybe scraping. I thought it might be a bear, though I hadn't seen or heard anything directly. I tried to push the thought aside and kept walking. Still, a feeling nagged at me. I wasn't alone out there. When I returned to the cabin that evening, The sun was low and the shadows stretched long across the porch. I lit the fire again and cooked some canned stew, watching the flames reflect in the window glass. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, a small habit from years living in the city. The woods seemed quieter now, almost too quiet. I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching me from just beyond the tree line. The third day was the hardest. I woke to the sound of something heavy crashing through the brush near the cabin. It was early, just after dawn, and the light was dim and gray. I sat up slowly, heart pounding. Outside, the trees shook as something moved quickly and roughly. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and moved cautiously to the window. Peering out, I could see tall trees swaying but no clear shape. Whatever it was had disappeared into the forest. But the ground below was freshly disturbed. Leaves torn up and small branches snapped. I spent the morning walking the perimeter of the property, looking for signs. There were definitely tracks, large, deep, and spaced out like someone or something had been walking heavily. I took pictures with my phone, but there was no signal to send them anywhere. When I came back, I noticed the door to the cabin was slightly ajar, though I was sure I had locked it the night before. Panic crept in. I checked everything again. No other signs of forced entry. I told myself maybe I'd just not pushed the door hard enough, but the feeling of unease wouldn't leave. I tried to keep busy, cleaning the cabin and organizing my things, but my eyes kept darting to the windows and the forest beyond. The sun disappeared behind thick clouds, and the wind picked up, howling through the trees. I lit a fire but didn't feel warm. The woods outside seemed darker, almost alive. That night, the crashing sounds returned. Louder this time, branches breaking, something big moving closer. I sat frozen, the fire burning low. Then came a long, deep growl. Not an animal sound I'd ever heard, something heavier and stranger. My heart hammered. I grabbed a kitchen knife and stayed by the fireplace, eyes glued to the windows. The sounds faded after a while, but I didn't sleep. I kept listening to the night, hearing faint rustling and the occasional snap of twigs. When dawn finally came, the air was cold and still. On the fourth day, I considered leaving. The noises and strange marks made me feel unsafe. But the road was long and tricky to navigate, especially with the recent rain turning dirt to mud. I decided to stay one more day and then leave early the next morning. I spent the day hiking again, this time sticking closer to the cabin. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I was overreacting. But every now and then, I caught a glimpse of movement far in the trees, shadows shifting just beyond my sight. I even thought I saw a figure, but when I blinked it was gone. When I got back to the cabin, I found something new. On the porch, there was a pile of rocks stacked carefully, almost like a marker. I hadn't put them there. The arrangement looked deliberate, but I had no idea why anyone would leave something like that. I knocked the pile over, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. That night, I didn't try to sleep in the bedroom. I set up a makeshift bed in the living room, close to the fireplace. I kept the knife and a large stick near me. The fire flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. At about midnight, I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy steps. I held my breath, straining to listen. Then came scratching at the door, something trying to get in. I grabbed the knife and quietly moved to the door. My hands trembled as I checked the locks. They were all secure. The scratching stopped suddenly. Then silence. I stayed awake until dawn, listening for any sign of movement outside. In the morning, I checked the porch. The wood was scratched and gouged deeply in places, like claws or maybe nails had torn at it. I took photos, but still no signal to send them anywhere. I knew I couldn't stay. I packed quickly and started the long walk back to the main road. The forest seemed quieter as I went, no sounds following me. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something, but there was only trees and sky. When I reached my car, relief washed over me. I locked the doors, started the engine, and pulled onto the highway. Back in town, I reported what had happened to the local ranger station. They listened carefully and said there had been reports of a large, wild animal seen in the area, a big bear or maybe a cougar, but no one knew for sure. They warned me to be careful if I went back. The experience stayed with me for weeks. I couldn't forget the feeling of being watched, the strange marks, and the heavy footsteps on the porch. But I also knew I had been lucky. The cabin was just a place in the woods, but the woods were home to things bigger and wilder than me. In the end, I never went back. The forest had its secrets, and I wasn't ready to face them again. But I kept the photos and the memory, a reminder that some places are better left alone, and some silences are louder than any noise. The sun was already low behind the trees when I finally pulled off the narrow dirt road onto the gravel driveway leading up to the cabin. The tires crunched on the loose stones as I eased the old car to a stop in front of the weathered wooden structure. It was an old cabin, plain and sturdy, built from rough-hewn logs stained a deep brown by years of wind and rain. I'd found it on a last-minute listing online, an affordable getaway far from the noise of the city, a place where I could spend a few days alone, unwind, and maybe clear my head. The air was cool and smelled sharp with pine and damp earth. I grabbed my bags and unlocked the creaky door, pushing it open to let in the dimming light. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and a small kitchenette in the corner. A worn rug covered part of the wooden floor, and an old couch sat opposite a tiny TV perched on a rickety stand. Dust coated some surfaces, but it felt lived in, not abandoned. I set my things down and walked over to the window. The woods stretched dense and silent, the tops of the tall trees swaying faintly in the evening breeze. The sky was streaked with orange and pink as the sun slipped behind the horizon, the shadows growing longer and darker by the minute. I was glad I'd arrived before full darkness settled in. After unpacking, I lit a fire in the hearth. The crackling flames filled the room with warmth and a soft glow. I cooked a simple dinner, canned beans heated over the stove, some bread I'd brought along, and ate while watching the fire flicker. Outside, the sounds of the forest grew more pronounced. The rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird settling in for the night, the steady hum of insects. The first night passed quietly. I slept on the creaky bed upstairs, the wooden walls seeming to absorb every sound. Occasionally, the wind pressed against the cabin like a soft whisper, but nothing more. Morning came with gray clouds and a faint drizzle tapping the windows. I made coffee and sat on the porch, wrapped in a sweater, watching the mist curl around the trees. I planned to spend the day hiking nearby trails, exploring the area. The woods were thick and green, branches heavy with moss and dripping with rain. The path underfoot was soft and muddy, marked by the tracks of small animals. I walked slowly, enjoying the smell of wet leaves and pine needles, the peaceful quiet apart from the occasional snap of a twig beneath my boots. But as I ventured deeper, a strange feeling began to creep over me. The forest seemed too quiet. The usual chatter of birds and rustling squirrels was missing. Even the wind had died down. It was as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. I stopped and looked around. The shadows between the trunks seemed thicker, darker. My skin prickled, and I forced myself to keep moving, telling myself it was just my imagination. After about an hour, I reached a small clearing with a shallow pond, its surface still and mirror-like. I knelt down to splash some water on my face when I heard it. The faintest crunching sound, like footsteps, but slower and heavier than any animal I knew. My heart quickened. I stood up and scanned the trees. Nothing moved. I tried to calm down, convincing myself it was probably another hiker or a deer, but there was no sign of anyone else around. The forest was empty. I decided to head back. The trail back felt longer, the way less familiar somehow. The shadows stretched unnaturally, and the trees seemed to crowd closer, their trunks blotting out the fading daylight. Every crackle of a branch or rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. Suddenly, I heard it again. Footsteps, this time closer and definitely human. I stopped, listening hard. The sound came from behind a thicket, just off the trail. I held my breath. For a moment, silence. Then a faint rustle, like someone moving carefully through the underbrush. I looked but saw nothing. The hair on my arms stood up. I broke into a run, pushing through the trees, dodging low branches, heart hammering. The cabin had never seemed so far away. When I finally stumbled onto the gravel driveway, gasping for breath, the cabin's windows glowed warmly. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me and sliding the bolt tight. Inside, the silence was thick. I could hear the fire crackling in the hearth and my own ragged breathing. I checked the windows. Nothing outside but the trees swaying in the wind. I sat down heavily, trying to calm my racing heart. I told myself I'd probably imagine the footsteps, maybe a hunter or some hikers. Still, the fear lingered like a shadow. That night, sleep was fitful. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind against the walls made me jump. I kept the fire burning, its warm light pushing back the darkness outside. The next day, I stayed closer to the cabin, clearing brush from around the porch, collecting firewood. I checked the locks and windows repeatedly. The sense of being watched was hard to shake. Late that afternoon, while gathering wood near the edge of the clearing, I found something that stopped me cold. A pair of muddy footprints, fresh, leading from the woods straight to the cabin. They were large, heavy prints, too big for any animal around here. I followed them back toward the trees. They disappeared into the undergrowth about 50 feet from the cabin. I scanned the area but found nothing else. No other tracks, no broken branches, no sign of whoever had been there. The thought that someone had been so close to me, watching, hiding, unsettled me more than anything else. I gathered my wood quickly and moved inside, locking the door and windows again. I checked my phone, no signal. I felt trapped, alone, and vulnerable. The night after that was worse. I heard noises outside, soft thumps on the roof, scraping sounds along the walls, the faint dragging of something heavy. I stayed inside, silent and tense, clutching a heavy stick I'd found outside earlier. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move just beyond the window. I pressed myself flat against the floor, heart pounding. Morning brought little relief. I debated leaving, but the roads were muddy from the rain, and the car might get stuck if I tried to drive out right away. I tried to convince myself it was just animals or the wind, but deep down, I knew someone had been there, maybe watching me, maybe waiting. That day, I made a plan. I collected every heavy piece of firewood I could find and stacked it by the door. I dug through my bag and found an old hunting knife and a small first aid kit. I kept the fire going all day and night. I sat near the window, eyes scanning the tree line. Around midnight, the noises started again. The scraping on the walls, the thumps on the roof. I stayed quiet and still, trying not to breathe too loud. Then, I heard something else. A low, slow scraping at the back door. It was deliberate, careful. I gripped the knife and edged toward the kitchen, where the back door was. My hands trembled. The scratching stopped. Silence. I waited, listening. Nothing. I slowly peered through the small window by the door. The porch was empty. The shadows were long and twisting in the firelight. Then, in the distance, I caught a glimpse of movement, a dark figure slipping behind a tree. I backed away quickly, locking the door tight. I realized then that someone had been stalking me for days, hiding just beyond the edge of the woods, watching my every move. I knew I couldn't stay. The next morning, before dawn, I packed everything into the car, careful not to make noise. I took one last look at the cabin, its walls scarred by the night scratching, the quiet woods that had held their secrets too close. I drove off the muddy driveway and onto the dirt road. As I left the forest behind, the fear slowly faded. I knew I had been lucky. The cabin was no longer a place of peace, but a reminder that sometimes the scariest things are the ones you can't see but can feel breathing just beyond the shadows. I never went back. From that trip on, I chose places where people were around, where the woods weren't so silent, and the shadows didn't feel alive. That cabin taught me something important. Sometimes the wilderness hides more than just trees and animals. Sometimes it hides people who want to stay hidden, watching from the darkness, waiting for the right moment. And the only way to stay safe is to listen carefully, trust your instincts, and never ignore the signs. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. After months of city noise, work stress, and endless deadlines, I finally got a chance to spend a few days alone in a small cabin deep in the woods. The cabin wasn't new, but it was sturdy and stood at the edge of a dense forest near a lake. I rented it for 4 days, wanting nothing but silence and some time to clear my head. I thought I was prepared for anything, except how fast a simple trip could turn into something else. I arrived at the cabin just before dusk. The drive was long and winding, with the asphalt fading into gravel and dirt roads, bordered by thick trees on either side. The sun hung low in the sky, painting everything gold and orange. The fresh smell of pine filled the air, and the sound of birds was everywhere. The cabin was modest. A single room with a little kitchen, a wood stove, and a narrow porch facing the lake. The water looked calm, reflecting the fading light. I parked the car near the cabin and unloaded my bag. The place smelled like old wood and dust, mixed with the faint scent of pine needles. I went inside and set down my things, feeling a wave of peace wash over me. The windows showed the forest all around, thick and still. I stacked some wood for the stove and made a simple dinner on the tiny gas burner. A can of beans warmed with a little butter and bread. As I ate, the sky darkened, and the first stars came out. I opened the windows to let the cool evening air in. The forest outside seemed quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird settling down for the night. The calmness felt good, like a reset button for my mind. Later, I built a small fire in the stove and sat close, the warmth spreading through the room. I read for a while, then lay down on the narrow bed by the window. Outside, the moon had risen, casting pale light over the lake. I could hear water lapping gently at the shore and the faint hoot of an owl somewhere deep in the woods. I had brought a flashlight, extra batteries, and my phone, although the signal was weak here. I told myself everything was fine. I was safe. I had planned this carefully, enough food, water, and basic supplies for emergencies. The only wild thing was the forest, and I knew enough to be cautious. But around midnight, something shifted. The night grew colder, and the sounds of the forest changed. The usual quiet was replaced by a deeper stillness, broken only by occasional twigs snapping nearby. I didn't see anything through the window, but I could feel eyes watching me. It was the kind of feeling that creeps up on you when you're alone, and your mind starts to fill in the gaps. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just tired. Maybe a deer or some other animal was moving close to the cabin. The forest was alive with wildlife, after all. But the snapping noises came again, closer this time, not far from the porch. I got up slowly and grabbed the flashlight. The beam cut through the dark like a knife, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. I stepped outside, the cold air hitting my face hard. The beam of light moved slowly around the clearing. I could see footprints in the soft dirt near the porch. They were fresh and big, too big for a deer. They looked like boot prints. I froze. Whoever it was, they had been right outside my cabin. I hadn't heard footsteps at all. My heart beat faster as I scanned the edge of the forest. There was nothing moving, just dark shapes of trees. I went back inside and locked the door. I checked the windows to make sure they were closed. My hands shook a little, but I told myself I was okay. Maybe a hunter had wandered close by. The footprints didn't look threatening, just careless. I sat back down near the stove, trying to calm my breathing. The fire was dying low, but the room felt warmer than outside. I stared at the shadows on the wall and tried to distract myself with my book, but the feeling of being watched stayed. Around 2 a.m, I heard it again. A slow, deliberate tapping on the cabin wall closest to the forest. Not loud, but steady. I didn't move at first, too scared to react. Then the tapping stopped. Silence. I waited a long moment, but nothing else happened. I grabbed my phone and tried to call 911, but no signal. I texted my sister, just saying I was okay and would check in the morning. She replied almost immediately. That helped a little. I kept the flashlight near me all night, sitting in the bed, eyes wide open. When dawn finally came, the first weak light through the windows felt like a blessing. In the morning, I went outside to look around the cabin more carefully. The footprints were gone, washed away by rain overnight. But I found something else near the back of the cabin. A small pile of rocks, stacked carefully in a neat little tower. It looked deliberate, like someone had left a marker. I didn't know what to think, but it felt like a message. I took a photo and put on my jacket. I needed to get out of there, but my car was still parked where I had left it. I felt uneasy leaving the cabin, but worse staying. Before I left, I double-checked all the locks and windows. I packed quickly, trying not to look behind me. On my way to the car, I heard a faint noise, a soft crunch of leaves under heavy boots. I turned fast, shining my flashlight toward the edge of the trees. I saw a shadow move back into the woods. My heart pounded, but I didn't run. I got in the car and locked the doors. The engine started on the first try, and I drove away slowly, glancing in the rearview mirror. The road back was silent, the forest closing in on both sides. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see someone following me. But no one appeared. When I reached the main highway, I felt the tension ease for the first time since I arrived. I called my sister again, and this time the signal was strong. I told her I was leaving, and she said she'd be waiting for me. The whole trip home was a mix of relief and nerves. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched for days. But I was safe now. The city noise was back, but so was the sense of security. Looking back, I think the scariest part wasn't the noises or the footprints. It was the unknown, knowing someone had been so close but never seen, never caught. No words, no threats, just the silent presence in the dark woods. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who was there or why they came so close, but I learned something important. Sometimes the real danger isn't what you see or hear, it's what you don't. The old cabin sat deep in the woods, far off from any road or town. It was a small, weather-beaten building made of rough logs, with a sagging roof and windows clouded by dirt and time. I had found it listed in a local rental guide, a simple place for a quiet weekend away from the city noise, the kind of place where you could be alone with your thoughts, with nothing but trees and the sound of the wind for company. I wanted that, to get away, to clear my head, to escape the busy world for a little while. I arrived late afternoon, the sun hanging low and turning the sky into shades of orange and pink. The forest around the cabin was dense, tall pines crowding close together, their needles whispering in the light breeze. The air smelled fresh and sharp, filled with pine sap and damp earth. It felt clean, like a reset button for my mind. The path to the cabin was rough, barely more than a trail that cars had worn down over the years. When I reached the small clearing where the cabin stood, I noticed how still everything was. No birds sang, no squirrels darted about. The silence was deep and heavy, pressing in on me, but I pushed that feeling aside. I was here to relax, not to worry. The cabin door creaked open with a stubborn groan. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and old dust. The floorboards were worn but sturdy, and the walls lined with faded wallpaper peeling at the corners. A small stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold and empty now, but promising warmth once I got a fire going. There was a simple wooden table and 2 chairs, a bed pushed into the far corner with a thin mattress, and a small kitchenette with an old stove and sink. No running water, but a well outside was supposed to provide fresh water. I set my bags down and walked around, running my fingers over the rough wood of the walls, feeling the cabin's history. Someone had lived here before, maybe many people over the years, and all of them had left bits of themselves behind. It felt strange and lonely, but also comforting in a way, a place untouched by time. I spent the next hour gathering wood from a nearby pile and building a fire in the fireplace. The flames flickered and crackled, casting dancing shadows across the cabin's rough interior. Outside, the light faded fast, and soon the forest was plunged into night. The darkness felt complete, almost solid, pressing up against the windows. As the fire burned low, I sat back in the chair and listened. The wind sighed through the trees, and every so often a branch scraped against the cabin's walls. Somewhere far off, an owl hooted. The sounds were natural but unfamiliar, reminding me I was far from any town or neighbors. The silence stretched on, deep and heavy. Around midnight, I decided to check on the water. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The air was colder now, sharp against my skin. The moon was just a thin crescent, barely lighting the path. The trees seemed taller, their shadows stretching long and dark across the ground. I followed the trail to the well, an old stone circle covered in moss and leaves. The water was clear and cold when I dipped my cup in, and I drank deeply. I looked around, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. For a moment, I thought I heard something move in the trees, branches snapping softly, a faint rustle like footsteps. I froze and held my breath. The woods were still again. Probably an animal, I told myself. Deer or raccoon maybe. Nothing to worry about. Back inside, I closed and locked the cabin door. I made sure the fire was safely contained, then crawled into the thin bed. The cabin felt colder now, the walls seeming to close in. My mind wandered to all the stories you hear about places like this. People getting lost, strange noises in the night, things lurking just out of sight. I shook the thoughts away. I was alone here, safe, and nothing was going to happen. But sleep didn't come easily. Every little noise startled me. The creak of the wood as it shifted in the cold, the whisper of wind outside, the soft thump of something heavy falling somewhere beyond the clearing. I kept my flashlight close, ready to grab it if needed. Hours passed in a restless haze. Just before dawn, I heard it, a soft tapping, like fingers drumming on wood. Slow, deliberate, coming from outside the cabin door. My heart hammered. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The tapping stopped, replaced by a faint scraping sound, like something being dragged across the ground. I wanted to tell myself it was a branch or a rock falling, but the sound was too steady, too purposeful. I lay there frozen, every muscle tense. The scraping moved around the cabin, slow and steady, circling the building. My mind raced with thoughts of someone out there, someone watching me in the dark. After what felt like forever, the noises stopped. The forest fell silent again. I waited a long time, too afraid to move, before finally gathering the courage to peek through the window. The clearing was empty, only the trees standing guard in the pale dawn light. When the sun finally rose, the cold fear started to fade, replaced by a tired relief. I left the cabin door open and stepped outside, scanning the ground for any clues. Near the back, I found a long scratch in the wood of the cabin's logs, fresh and rough, as if someone had dragged a sharp object across it. Not far from that, footprints in the soft dirt led back toward the forest, too big and uneven to be any animal I knew. I packed quickly, eager to leave the cabin behind. As I gathered my things, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me from the tree line. But there was nothing, just the quiet forest and the morning sun filtering through the leaves. I locked the cabin door one last time and started down the trail toward my car. The forest felt alive with light now, the fear of the night shrinking with every step. The woods were just trees and shadows, nothing more. But I knew I wouldn't forget the quiet tapping or the scraping sounds anytime soon. That night, alone in the cabin, taught me something simple but real. Out there in the wilderness, sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or stories. Sometimes they are the very real, very human shadows you can't see until it's almost too late. Driving away, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. The cabin was just a place, but something about it, the silence, the darkness, the unknown presence, had unsettled me deeper than I expected. I promised myself I wouldn't come back, not for a long time, if ever. Some places, I realized, are better left alone. The forest holds its secrets tight, and some things are meant to stay hidden in the dark. The cabin stood at the edge of a dense forest, hidden deep in the mountains where cell phone signals faded away like distant echoes. I had found it through a small online listing, a modest place with a worn wooden porch, a rusted metal roof, and windows clouded with years of grime. The photos showed a simple, quiet retreat, perfect for the solitude I craved. I wanted nothing more than to escape the noise of the city, the constant hum of life, and to spend some time alone, disconnected. I packed my things with care, loaded the car, and set off early on a Saturday morning. The drive itself was long and winding. Highway asphalt gave way to narrow, cracked roads bordered by thick trees. Sunlight filtered through the leaves and patches, creating moving mosaics of light and shadow. Every mile further into the mountains, the air grew cooler and the sounds of civilization faded behind me. The only noises were the distant calls of birds, the rustling of branches, and the soft hum of my engine. As I got closer, I noticed more signs of neglect. Old, faded signs warning of wildlife, abandoned trucks covered in moss, and gravel paths swallowed by weeds. It was as if time here moved differently, slower and less forgiving. I reached the cabin just before noon. It looked smaller in person than it had online, almost fragile against the backdrop of towering pines. The porch creaked underfoot as I stepped out, the boards warped and splintered in places. I set my bags down and took a slow breath, the scent of pine needles and damp earth filling my lungs. The silence was complete. No birdsong, no distant engines, no voices. Just the occasional snap of a twig from some unseen animal moving in the underbrush. The door opened with a groan, revealing the interior. A single room with a small kitchen in one corner, a wood stove against the far wall, and a rickety table surrounded by mismatched chairs. The floor was uneven, with dusty floorboards that moaned with every step. The windows were thick with dirt and cobwebs, but the weak sunlight still managed to shine through. A musty smell hung in the air, a mix of old wood, dampness, and forgotten memories. I set about making the place livable. First, I opened all the windows to air out the cabin. The breeze swept in, carrying the forest's fresh scent inside. I wiped down surfaces, stacked some dry wood by the stove, and checked the small fridge, which was still humming quietly despite the power being off. The place had no electricity, no running water, exactly what I wanted. I was ready to be self-sufficient, to live simply for a few days. For the next few hours, I wandered around the property. There was a small clearing behind the cabin, ringed by tall trees, where the sunlight poured down in golden pools. I noticed footprints near the back door. Some looked fresh, others older and more faded. Mostly animal tracks, I assumed. Deer, raccoons, maybe a coyote or two. The forest beyond was thick and dark, the trees growing close together with little undergrowth, as if the shadows themselves kept the floor clear. Birds flitted from branch to branch, and every so often I caught sight of a squirrel or rabbit darting away from my footsteps. Night, things changed. The forest became a different place after dark. Heavier, thicker, almost oppressive. The silence was no longer peaceful but thick with unseen presence. I had brought a lantern and some candles, but their light felt weak against the vast darkness pressing in through the windows. I made a small fire in the wood stove to warm the room and settled in with a book. The flickering flames cast long shadows that danced along the walls, twisting and shifting in ways that made me uneasy. Every snap and crackle of burning would seem amplified, breaking the silence with sudden bursts. I heard the first sound late that night, a faint scraping, like claws dragging across wood. It was slow and deliberate, coming from just outside the cabin. My heart jumped, but I told myself it was probably a raccoon or some small animal. I stayed still, listening. The noise stopped after a moment, but my skin felt prickly, as if unseen eyes were watching me. Sleep was difficult. The bed was old and creaked with every movement. Outside, the wind rustled through the branches, making the trees sway and groan. Every few minutes, I heard more noises. A distant thump, the shuffle of feet on leaves, or the sharp snap of a broken twig. I kept a flashlight by the bed and stayed awake, waiting, alert. The next day, I explored more. I followed a narrow trail leading away from the cabin, deeper into the forest. The path twisted through thick ferns and moss-covered rocks, the canopy above blocking much of the sky. Sunlight barely reached the ground. I noticed more signs, broken branches at odd angles, disturbed patches of dirt, and animal droppings. There was something off about the trail. It felt like it was being used, but not by the usual forest animals. As the afternoon wore on, The sky grew cloudy and the air took on a heavier feel. I turned back, eager to get inside before dark. The forest seemed quieter now, almost too quiet. The usual sounds of birds or rustling leaves were gone. A heavy stillness settled around me, like the forest was holding its breath. Back at the cabin, I made a simple dinner of canned beans and bread. I ate slowly, keeping the lantern close. As night fell, the scraping sound returned, louder this time, circling the cabin like something was pacing just beyond the walls. I tried to calm myself, convincing myself it was an animal looking for food, but the noise was too steady, too intentional. Sleep eluded me again. I sat by the stove, my eyes darting to the windows every few seconds. Outside, the darkness seemed to pulse and shift, shadows moving where no light should be. The scraping became scratching, then pounding. At one point, I saw a faint outline through the grimy glass. A figure standing just beyond the porch, barely visible in the dim light of the moon. My breath caught. I grabbed the only weapon I had, a heavy metal flashlight, and moved cautiously to the door. I hesitated, fingers trembling on the latch. I could hear heavy breathing just outside, slow and labored. I opened the door a crack and shone the light outward. Nothing. The forest was empty. No figure, no movement, only the soft rustling of leaves. I locked the door quickly and bolted it with a wooden chair. My heart pounded in my chest, my body slick with sweat. I sat back down and tried to steady my breathing. Whoever or whatever had been there was gone for now, but I knew it would come back. The next morning, I found fresh footprints around the cabin, large, heavy prints, too big for any animal I knew. They circled the porch, stopped at the door, then vanished into the trees. I felt a sinking feeling in my chest, a cold weight of fear I couldn't shake. I packed what I could and decided to leave. I wasn't willing to spend another night in that place. But when I tried to start my car, it wouldn't turn over. The battery was dead, or worse. The radio was silent, and my phone showed no signal. Trapped. I thought about hiking out, but the forest was vast and unfamiliar. Without proper supplies or a clear trail, it could take days. I wasn't prepared to spend that much time out there, not with something lurking nearby. As night fell again, the noises started anew, louder and closer. Scratching at windows, pounding on walls, heavy footsteps circling the cabin. I kept my flashlight ready, my ears straining for any sound of rescue or escape. Then I heard the voice, not spoken words, but a low, guttural growl, mixed with heavy breathing. It was a sound from something alive but terrifyingly close to human, or maybe not quite human. The pounding became frantic, desperate, and I realized it wasn't just some wild animal or prankster. It was someone or something trapped and angry. I spent the entire night huddled in the corner, the flashlight shining out into the dark, ready to defend myself. When dawn finally came, the pounding stopped. The forest was silent once again. I checked the car, and miraculously, it started on the second try. I didn't look back as I drove down the mountain, the cabin disappearing behind me in the morning mist. Later, I learned from the locals that the area had a history of squatters and desperate people hiding out in the woods. Some fleeing the law, others lost or broken by their lives. Sometimes, those people would come close to the cabins, searching for food or shelter. The footprints, the noises, the figure I saw, all signs of someone else struggling in the dark, trying to survive. It wasn't a ghost or fairy tale creature, just a harsh reality of isolation, desperation, and fear in the wilderness. I never went back. The cabin stayed empty, a silent reminder that some places, no matter how peaceful they seem, hold more than just quiet trees and fresh air. They hold the echoes of lives fraying at the edges, desperate to be seen, and sometimes dangerous to encounter. I was lucky to get out when I did. The forest took back its silence. I didn't expect the trip to be like that. I had been planning a simple weekend away to clear my head. Just me, the woods, and a small cabin I rented deep in the mountains. I wanted silence, fresh air, and a break from the city noise. The kind of place where the nearest neighbor is miles away, where cell service is spotty at best, and the biggest problem is making sure you have enough firewood. I had been there once before, a couple of years ago, and everything went smooth. The cabin was small but cozy, built from old pine logs with a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen, a small bed, and a porch that looked out over a clearing surrounded by thick forest. The road was rough but passable in a regular car if you took it slow. The last few miles I drove alone, winding up a narrow gravel path lined by thick trees. The air smelled fresh and a little damp from the recent rain. The sun was starting to lower, casting long shadows through the branches. I remember feeling a sense of calm as I pulled up and saw the cabin resting quietly among the tall pines. It looked just as I remembered, weathered but sturdy, with a thin plume of smoke curling up from the chimney. Inside, I unpacked quietly, setting out my supplies for the next couple of days. Food, water, a stack of firewood I brought in, a lantern, a book, and some clothes. I like to keep it simple. I built a fire in the fireplace, and as the flames cracked and warmed the small room, I settled in to read. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees. It was peaceful, but as night fell, the feeling changed. Not in a scary way at first, just quieter. The forest sounds, the birds, the squirrels, the distant river, faded until only the rustling leaves and the occasional snap of a twig remained. I shut the windows against the chill and sat close to the fire, feeling the heat on my face. The cabin was warm, but there was a coolness just outside that made the wooden floorboards creak now and then. Later, I stepped outside to grab more firewood stacked near the back porch. The moon was low and partially hidden by clouds, and the trees cast long, shifting shadows. The air smelled like pine and earth and something wet. The ground was soft and uneven underfoot, leaves and pine needles muffling my steps. I had brought a small flashlight, but I didn't want to use it much. I trusted my eyes to adjust to the dark. That's when I noticed something odd. Off in the distance, beyond the clearing, I thought I saw a faint light moving among the trees. At first, I thought maybe a hunter or someone else staying nearby, but I knew the nearest road was miles away. There were no other cabins for at least half a mile in any direction. The light wasn't steady like a flashlight beam. It flickered and shifted, almost like a candle or a small lantern being carried slowly. I stood still and watched for a moment, but it disappeared behind a thick cluster of trees. The woods were dense here, and the shadows shifted quickly. My heart started to beat a little faster. I reminded myself that it was probably just a deer reflecting my flashlight or a trick of the light. Still, I kept my back to the cabin and looked carefully. Nothing else moved. I went back inside and locked the door. I didn't mention the light to anyone. There was no one to mention it to, but it stayed in my mind as I went to bed. I slept lightly, waking often to the creaks and groans of the cabin settling in the cold night. The next day, I went out for a walk along the small trail behind the cabin. The sun was higher now, warm on my skin through breaks in the trees. I liked the way the light came through the leaves, casting patterns on the dirt path. I found a small stream, clear and cold, where I refilled my water bottle. The forest was alive with birdsong and the buzz of insects. I felt better, but the feeling of being watched didn't fully go away. As I walked back to the cabin, I noticed something else. Strange footprints in the soft dirt near the porch. They were large and uneven, not the usual animal prints. I bent down to look closely. The prints were deep, as if whoever made them was heavy, but the shape was strange, almost like a boot with a thick sole, but with some uneven edges. I didn't recognize them. I looked around carefully, but there was no sign of anyone. No other tracks, no broken branches or leaves crushed underfoot. Just these prints leading from the edge of the forest to the cabin and back again, like someone had been pacing near the porch. That unsettled me. I checked the windows and doors. They were all closed and locked. Nothing looked disturbed inside. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I spent the afternoon gathering firewood, chopping logs, and preparing for the night. The sun dropped again, and the shadows grew long. I built a larger fire in the pit outside and sat nearby, watching the flames. The forest was silent except for the crackling fire and the occasional rustle of leaves. Then I heard it, A soft sound, like a slow, deliberate step on dry leaves behind me. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I slowly turned my head, shining my flashlight toward the trees. Nothing, just darkness and shadows. I kept the fire going and stayed close. The night stretched on with no more noises, but the tension didn't leave me. On the third day, I noticed something else strange. My food supplies were lighter than they should have been. I had carefully counted what I brought, and it didn't add up. Some of the bread I kept wrapped in plastic had been torn open and half-eaten. I was careful to keep everything sealed in containers and inside the cabin. How had something gotten in? I checked the cabin thoroughly. Doors and windows were locked. There was no sign of forced entry. The only way in seemed to be the main door or windows. None showed any damage. I began to think maybe an animal, like a raccoon or a squirrel, had found a way in through a small crack or gap somewhere. But I couldn't find any hole big enough. That night, I left the cabin door locked but unlatched, just in case. I slept with the lantern lit and ready beside my bed. I didn't hear any noises, but I didn't sleep well either. On the fourth day, I decided to leave early. The peace I sought was gone, replaced by a steady, creeping unease. I packed quickly, clearing out the cabin, stacking firewood back, and putting trash in bags to take with me. As I was about to leave, I heard a noise from the woods behind the cabin. It was loud and sharp, like the snap of a heavy branch underfoot. I stopped and turned, shining my flashlight into the trees. My heart was pounding. There, about 50 feet away, I saw a figure standing between the trees. At first, it was just a dark shape, but then I saw it clearly. A man wearing a dark jacket and boots, his face half hidden by shadows. He didn't move. He just stood there watching. I didn't call out or shout. I didn't want to startle him. Instead, I slowly stepped back toward the cabin, keeping my eyes on him. He didn't follow. He just stood still and disappeared into the woods after a few seconds. I didn't wait around. I jumped into my car and drove off as fast as I could, the gravel road kicking up dust behind me. The weight in my chest only eased once I was back on the main road, with other cars passing and cell signal returning. Later, when I got home, I called the local ranger station and told them what happened. They told me the area was known for illegal hunters and squatters who sometimes used abandoned cabins. They warned me to be careful and to report anything suspicious. The whole experience stayed with me, making me appreciate the safety and noise of the city more than ever. The forest is beautiful, but it's also wild, and sometimes wild means danger. Not ghosts or monsters, but people who don't belong, who hide and watch. I don't regret going to the cabin, but I won't be going back anytime soon. The quiet can hide things you don't want to find, and sometimes the scariest part of the woods is not what's out there in the trees, but what's waiting quietly just beyond the clearing. The sun was already low in the sky when I pulled onto the gravel road leading to the cabin. The air smelled sharp with pine and damp earth, the forest thick and silent on both sides of the narrow path. I had been driving for hours, leaving behind the noise and rush of the city, craving the quiet that only a remote place could offer. The cabin was supposed to be a simple refuge, a place to clear my mind and get away from everything. But from the moment I saw the peeling paint and sagging porch, I knew this weekend would be different from the peaceful escape I had imagined. The cabin stood alone in a small clearing, surrounded by tall trees that swayed slightly in the cold breeze. The windows were dusty and dim, the kind of glass that made the inside look shadowed even when the sun was out. The wooden steps creaked as I climbed up and pushed open the heavy door. Inside, the air was stale and smelled faintly of mold and old wood. The floorboards were warped and uneven, and dust covered most surfaces. It was clear no one had been here in a long time. I dropped my bags on the cracked floor near the door and flicked on the flashlight I had brought. The cabin was small, just one room that served as kitchen, living area, and bedroom all at once. A rusty old stove sat in the corner, alongside a battered sink with peeling paint around the edges. A small table leaned slightly to one side, and two rickety chairs stood by it. The bed was just a thin mattress on a wooden frame, covered by a faded blanket. I pulled back the curtains to let in what little light was left, revealing cobwebs in the corners and a thick layer of dust on every surface. I had chosen this place because it was cheap and off the grid. No cell service, no internet, no distractions. I wanted to disconnect, to be alone with my thoughts. But as the last rays of sun disappeared behind the trees, the isolation started to feel heavy, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I set about making the place a little more livable. I cleaned the dust off the table, swept the floor with an old broom I found in the corner, and checked the stove. It was cold and rusty but seemed intact. I had brought canned food, bottled water, and a small portable heater just in case the temperature dropped too low. As night fell, I lit a couple of candles and sat by the window, watching the forest darken into a black silhouette against the sky. The silence was absolute. No cars, no animals, no wind. Even the usual night sounds seemed muffled. I thought about how far I was from the nearest town, how alone I really was. A few hours passed, and I felt the first tug of unease. It wasn't fear exactly, more a creeping sense of being watched, of something waiting just beyond the trees. I tried to shake it off and went to bed early. The mattress was hard and uncomfortable, and the cabin was colder than I expected. I wrapped myself in the thin blanket and stared at the ceiling, the faint flicker of candlelight casting strange shadows on the walls. Every creak of the wood made me jump. Every rustle outside set my heart racing. But sleep finally came. Around 2 a.m, I woke to a noise. It was faint, almost like scratching or dragging, coming from outside. I lay still, listening. The sound stopped. I told myself it was probably just an animal, a raccoon or a deer moving through the underbrush. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and shone it toward the window. The beam sliced through the darkness, catching the outline of trees and thick bushes. Nothing moved. I forced myself to lie back down. Maybe it was nothing, but my mind wouldn't settle. I kept hearing small noises, twigs snapping, the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel, like someone or something was moving just outside the clearing. I considered packing up and leaving right then, but the thought of driving back in the dark on unfamiliar roads made me stay. By morning, the unease had turned into something heavier. I went outside to inspect the area around the cabin. The ground was damp from last night's rain, and the forest floor was littered with leaves and pine needles. Near the edge of the clearing, I noticed disturbed earth. Small patches where the soil looked freshly turned over, like something had been digging. There were no footprints, just these strange marks. I took a picture with my phone, though I knew I wouldn't have signal out here to send it anywhere. The rest of the day passed slowly. I chopped some firewood from a fallen branch, carried water from the small creek nearby, and explored the edges of the forest. The deeper I went, the darker and tighter the trees became, until it was hard to see more than a few feet ahead. I felt exposed and vulnerable, the kind of feeling you get when you realize you're not in control. I found an old trail, overgrown and unused, and wondered where it led. That night, I made a fire in the rusty stove. The warmth was welcome, but the flames threw flickering shadows against the walls, making the cabin seem alive in a way that made me uneasy. The noises came back, this time louder, closer. A scraping sound on the wood outside, a low rustling, like something brushing against the cabin walls. I sat frozen, staring at the door, willing myself to be brave. Then, I heard it. Something heavy hitting the outside wall. A sharp thud. I jumped up, heart pounding, and grabbed the flashlight. I moved to the door and looked through the peephole. Nothing. The night was still and black, with no sign of movement. I opened the door a crack, shining the light around the clearing. A pile of rocks had been stacked near the front steps. I hadn't seen them there before. The stones looked deliberately placed, as if someone wanted me to see them. Cold knot formed in my stomach. I spent the rest of the night awake, listening to every sound, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. When dawn finally came, I packed a small bag with essentials and decided to hike out before things got worse. I didn't want to spend another night there. As I left the cabin, I noticed more signs. Strange symbols scratched into the bark of trees, twigs arranged in patterns on the ground. Whoever had been here before me left these marks. Maybe they were warnings or messages. I didn't want to stick around to find out. The hike back was exhausting but felt safer than the cabin. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but the forest remained quiet. When I finally reached the gravel road, I breathed a deep sigh of relief and headed for my car. Back on the highway, the city lights felt warm and inviting. I couldn't wait to be back in my apartment, surrounded by noise and people. The cabin was nothing like the peaceful retreat I had imagined. It was a place that held something dark and unsettling, something human but unknown. I never went back, and I never told anyone about what I found. The experience stayed with me. Not a ghost story or fairy tale, but a real and raw reminder of how small and vulnerable we can be when cut off from the world. The forest hides many things, and some of them are better left alone. The sky was still a deep blue when I arrived at the cabin, the kind of blue that wraps around the edges of the night before the sun breaks free. I had driven for hours, winding through the quiet roads flanked by thick trees that towered on either side, their leaves whispering in the light evening breeze. The air smelled like pine and wet earth, a clean smell that felt almost sharp in my nose after the long ride through city traffic and exhaust fumes. I pulled off the narrow gravel road onto a short dirt path that led up to the cabin, the tires crunching on loose stones. It was a small wooden structure, tucked between a handful of tall firs, old but well cared for, with dark stains from rain and time on the logs that made it blend naturally into the forest. I stepped out of the car, shut the door with a soft thud, and stretched my legs. The sun was slipping lower behind the mountain ridges, casting long shadows that crept through the trees and blanketed the ground in patterns of light and dark. My backpack felt heavy on my shoulders, stuffed with food, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, some extra clothes, and a thin blanket. I locked the car and headed to the cabin door, where the metal handle was cold under my fingers. The cabin smelled faintly of damp wood and something earthy, like moss growing on rocks nearby. I stepped inside. Inside was simple. A small kitchen corner with a stove that looked old but clean, a wood-burning fireplace with a stack of logs nearby, a table with 2 chairs, and a bed pushed against the far wall with a thin mattress and a patchwork blanket folded at the foot. The windows were clear but smudged with dirt and spider webs, letting in the last light of day and showing the dark forest beyond. I set my bag down, took a deep breath, and moved to open the windows for fresh air, feeling the cool breeze drift in, carrying the faint sound of leaves rustling and distant birds. The plan was to stay the weekend, to get away from everything, the noise, the people, the city that never really felt like home. This cabin was off the grid. No electricity, no cell signal, nothing but the woods and the silence. I liked that kind of quiet sometimes. It gave space to think, to breathe. After unpacking, I started a fire in the fireplace. It took longer than I expected. The wood was damp from last night's rain, and smoke curled thickly before the flames caught properly. I pulled out a small metal kettle from my bag, filled it with water from a jug I'd brought, and set it on the stove to boil. The soft hiss and crackle of the fire filled the cabin, and I sat near it, warming my hands and feeling the heat seep into my bones. Outside, the sun vanished, and the forest darkened, the shadows deepening into thick black. That first night, I slept restlessly. The bed creaked whenever I shifted. The wooden walls seemed to sigh in the wind, and outside, the sounds of the forest were strange and unfamiliar. Owls hooted somewhere far off, and the branches scraped against the cabin like dry fingernails. I was alone, and that alone felt bigger than I was used to. But I told myself it was normal, just nature doing its thing. Morning came slow and soft, sunlight filtering through the trees like spilled gold. I brewed coffee on the stove and ate some canned beans. The forest outside looked calm and quiet in the early light, but as the day went on, I felt a growing unease I couldn't explain. Maybe it was just being alone, or maybe the way the cabin sat so deep in the woods, cut off from the world. Whatever it was, I tried not to let it get to me. I decided to explore. I took a backpack with water and a knife, walked down the dirt path that led from the cabin into the woods. The trees closed in tightly on either side, the path narrow and tangled with roots and fallen leaves. The deeper I went, the darker it got, even in daylight, the thick canopy blocking much of the sun. Birds flitted overhead, and small animals rustled in the underbrush. Every now and then, I stopped to catch my breath or listen. That afternoon, I came across an old hunting trail, barely visible, covered with broken branches and moss. I followed it, curious where it might lead. The forest was so dense here that the air felt cooler, damper. There were patches of mud, and I noticed footprints, some human, some deer. The human prints were fresh, the edges still sharp in the soft earth. That made me pause. The nearest town was miles away, and I hadn't seen a soul on the way in. I didn't feel threatened, but the presence of someone else so close unsettled me. I turned back toward the cabin, walking faster now, scanning the woods around me. The silence felt thicker. I kept hearing faint noises, twigs snapping, leaves crunching. But whenever I looked, nothing was there. It was just the forest moving, I told myself. I reached the cabin as the sun dipped low, its last rays barely touching the treetops. I locked the door behind me and checked the windows. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. That night, sleep was even harder to come by. I heard footsteps outside, soft but deliberate, circling the cabin. At one point, a branch cracked sharply, close enough to make me jump. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it outside, but all I saw were shadows dancing between the trees. I kept the fire burning as long as I could, watching the flames for comfort. When the fire finally died down, I wrapped myself tightly in the blanket, listening to the night sounds, alert and tense. The next morning, I found fresh footprints around the cabin's perimeter. They were too large and deep for an animal, and they didn't match mine. They were human footprints. Whoever had been there had come very close. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I thought about packing up and leaving, but something held me back. Maybe curiosity, maybe stubbornness. I spent the day fixing things around the cabin, stacking more firewood, cleaning the stove, trying to keep my mind busy. The forest seemed quieter now, almost too quiet. No birds, no rustling. The silence was heavy, pressing in. I kept hearing faint noises, voices maybe, but when I stopped to listen, all was still. That evening, I sat by the fire, trying to stay calm. The footsteps came again, louder and slower this time, circling the cabin's edge. I heard a low thud on the roof, like something heavy landing. I didn't want to look, but I knew I had to. I grabbed the flashlight, moved to the window, and shone it outside. A figure stood just beyond the trees, barely visible in the fading light. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. I stayed frozen, watching as the figure didn't move, just stood there staring at the cabin. The light flickered as the fire died down. Then, slowly, the figure turned and vanished into the woods. I waited a long time before moving or speaking, but nothing more came. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat by the dying fire, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. When dawn finally broke, pale and thin, I decided it was time to leave. I packed quickly, checking the doors and windows twice. Outside, the forest was calm again, the strange presence gone. As I drove away, I kept looking back toward the trees, half expecting to see that figure watching from the shadows. But there was nothing there, only the quiet forest reclaiming the space. Back in my city apartment, the silence felt strange and small compared to the vast, dark woods. But I was safe. The cabin was behind me, a place where the quiet was deeper than I'd ever known, and where something or someone had shared the night with me, unseen but unmistakably real. I didn't go back. The cabin stayed in my memory, a reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters, but the unknown people and quiet shadows that live just beyond the edges of our comfort. And sometimes, that's enough to make you want to leave the woods behind and never look back. The sky was a dull gray when I pulled off the main road and onto the narrow dirt track that led to the cabin. The whole trip had been planned on a whim, a break from the noise and rush of the city. A few days alone, just me and the woods. I hadn't been to this part of the forest before, but the map showed a small lake and a cabin for rent a few miles in. It was the kind of place that looked perfect in pictures. Old wooden walls, a stone chimney, a porch with a faded rocking chair. I told myself it was exactly what I needed. Quiet, isolation, time to think. The tires crunched over fallen leaves and scattered twigs as I drove deeper down the path. The trees grew thicker, their tall trunks stretching like dark pillars on both sides, blocking out most of the light. I parked next to the cabin, the engine ticking as it cooled, the scent of pine and wet earth filling the air. The place smelled old but solid. I grabbed my backpack and stepped out, feeling the chill of early autumn brushing against my skin. The cabin door creaked as I opened it. Inside, the smell was a mix of old wood and something faintly musty. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I stepped in. Sunlight filtered weakly through the grimy windows, casting long shadows across the room. A small kitchen was off to the left, with a rusty stove and a sink that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. To the right, a living area with a worn sofa and a rickety table. I dropped my bag and looked around. No electricity, no Wi-Fi, no phone signal. Just raw, quiet space. I unpacked my things slowly. A lantern, some canned food, bottled water, a small first aid kit, a thick blanket. I had planned for this. The isolation meant no distractions, but also meant I had to be careful. I checked the fireplace. The chimney looked clear. I gathered some dry wood from a small pile outside, broken branches and bits of bark, enough for a fire to keep me warm tonight. The sun sank lower as I stacked the wood and lit the fire. Flames crackled, throwing flickering light onto the rough walls. I sat close, watching the sparks rise and fade, feeling the warmth spread through the room. Outside, the forest whispered with the wind. The occasional bird call cut through the silence. As the evening deepened, I set about exploring the cabin more carefully. The floor creaked unevenly, and the windows rattled with the occasional gust. A small bedroom off the back held a simple bed with a threadbare mattress and a faded quilt. I opened the old dresser. Some clothes left behind, mostly moth-eaten and dusty. No one seemed to be living here. The place was quiet but not abandoned for long. It had the feeling of being forgotten slowly, piece by piece. I ate a simple meal, beans warmed on the stove and a can of peaches. I kept the lantern lit, the fire burning low but steady. Outside, the darkness pressed in thick and heavy. The stars were bright but scattered, the moon a thin sliver. The woods were alive with sounds. The rustle of animals moving through leaves, the snap of a branch breaking somewhere in the distance. I tried not to focus on those noises too much. When the fire finally died down, I wrapped myself in the blanket and lay on the bed, the thin mattress pressing into the wooden frame. The quiet was overwhelming. I stared at the ceiling, noticing the cracks and stains from years of weather. Outside, the wind picked up and sighed through the trees. It wasn't a comforting sound. It was the sound of something ancient and indifferent, reminding me how small I was out here. Sleep came slow. Every creak and whisper pulled me from rest. I kept thinking about the forest beyond the cabin walls. How easy it would be to lose my way, how dark and silent it could get, how little separated me from the vast wilderness. At some point in the night, I woke to a sharp noise. It was different from the usual wind or animal sounds. Something heavier, deliberate. I sat up quietly, listening hard. Footsteps, slow and uneven, outside the cabin. They stopped near the window. I froze, heart pounding, watching the darkness through the glass. There was nothing visible. Maybe an animal, maybe someone walking by, but the steps moved away, retreating into the blackness. I told myself it was nothing, just a deer or a raccoon, but the fear lingered, a cold weight in my chest. Morning light was a relief. I got up, lit the fire again, and prepared a simple breakfast. I told myself to stay calm, to keep busy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Not physically, but like the forest was watching, waiting. I spent the day walking around the lake nearby. The water was still and clear, reflecting the trees perfectly. No one else was around. The forest was beautiful but intimidating, thick with fallen leaves, tangled branches, and dense undergrowth. The quiet was deeper here, like a heavy blanket smothering every sound. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The small pile of wood I had left outside had been disturbed. Some logs were shifted, broken twigs scattered. Not like a natural mess from wind or animals. It was deliberate. Someone had been here, or maybe something. The thought hit me hard. The isolation wasn't just from the city. This place held secrets. People came here too sometimes. Maybe hunters or campers or worse. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, even though they were old and creaky. I made sure the fire was burning strong. I set the lantern on the table. I sat down, trying to steady my nerves. That night was worse. The noises outside grew louder. Footsteps again, this time circling the cabin. Branches snapped closer. Something brushed against the wall. The fire flickered dangerously low. I kept a baseball bat close, ready for anything. At one point, the lantern's light dimmed and went out. The cabin was plunged into total darkness. My breathing filled the silence, sharp and quick. I fumbled with matches, struck one finally, and the tiny flame flared up. Outside, a shadow moved just beyond the window. My heart jumped so hard I thought it might burst. But when I looked directly, there was nothing there. Just the black forest, silent and still. I stayed awake all night, the bat in my hands, the fire slowly dying. The fear was real and thick, but I refused to give in to panic. I had prepared for this. I had to keep calm, keep watch. Morning brought relief, but also a strange calm. The forest felt quieter, emptier. The sky was pale blue, the sun weak but steady. I packed up my things carefully, checked the cabin once more, and stepped outside. I didn't see anyone else on the path back, no signs of other people. Just the usual forest sounds, birds, wind, distant water. The cabin faded behind me as I walked back to the car. On the drive home, I thought about the whole trip, the beauty and the silence, the fear and the isolation, the strange feeling of being watched by something unseen. But I also felt stronger for facing it. The forest hadn't broken me. I hadn't given in to panic. I knew now how fragile safety was out here, how easily it could be taken away. The cabin was just a place. The woods were just trees and animals and shadows. And I was just someone who had walked through it, survived, and come out the other side. That was enough. The moment I pulled off the gravel road and onto the dirt path leading to the cabin, the air changed. It wasn't colder or anything, but the quiet pressed in on me like a thick blanket. I had driven for hours, leaving the small town behind and heading into the deep woods where cell service died and the world felt forgotten. My plan was simple: spend a weekend alone at the cabin my uncle had left me, unwind, and escape the noise of city life. I'd never stayed there before, never even been close. But now, with the old rusty gate creaking as I pushed it open and the sun dipping low behind the trees, I knew this place was real in a way I hadn't expected. The cabin stood alone on a small clearing surrounded by thick pine and oak trees, their trunks tall and dark in the fading light. The wood was weathered and gray, with some boards warped or cracked. A stone chimney rose crookedly on one side, and a narrow porch wrapped around the front with a broken rocking chair tipped on its side. The ground was littered with dry leaves, pine needles, and scattered bits of bark. I grabbed my bag and walked toward the porch, the dry leaves crunching under my boots. The air smelled sharp, full of earth and cold pine resin. Inside, the cabin was small but sturdy. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the windows were dusty and streaked, letting in the last light of day. There was a fireplace with a metal grate filled with old ashes, a small wooden table, a couple of rickety chairs, and a narrow bed against the far wall covered with a faded quilt. The kitchen corner had a cast iron stove, a sink with no running water, and some rusty utensils hanging on hooks. I set my bag down, pulled out a flashlight and some supplies I had brought: bottled water, canned food, a small first aid kit, and a battery-powered lantern. I had learned to come prepared. No electricity here, no running water, no phone signal. Just the woods and the silence. As night fell, the forest around the cabin thickened into shadows. I lit the lantern and settled in by the fireplace, stacking some dry wood I'd found near the back of the cabin. I managed to get a small fire going, the flames crackling and throwing flickering orange light on the walls. The cabin felt warm, but the dark outside was heavy. I ate some canned beans heated over the stove and drank water slowly. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves. I tried to rest early. Tomorrow, I planned to explore the woods, maybe find a trail or a creek nearby. But just as I lay down on the bed, I noticed something odd, faint sounds coming from outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind through the trees, but the noises were too irregular. There was a soft thud against the cabin wall, then a scrape, like something being dragged. My heart sped up, and I sat still, listening. The fire's light flickered against the walls as the noises continued. Closer now. I stayed silent, trying to make sense of it. Suddenly, a low, dragging sound came from the back of the cabin, near the woods. It wasn't heavy like a fallen branch, but slower, deliberate. The smell of something damp and earthy seemed to seep through the cracks in the cabin walls. I felt a chill run down my spine, but reminded myself I was alone and safe inside. Whatever it was, it hadn't come inside yet. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the small window at the back. Shining the beam through the glass, I saw nothing but darkness and tree trunks. Then, a faint glint caught the light. Something shiny on the ground, like metal. My pulse quickened. I wasn't expecting anyone else out here. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and I checked the place thoroughly before nightfall. I didn't hear any cars, footsteps, or voices. The sound stopped. Silence settled back over the forest, heavier than before. I sat back down, forcing myself to calm down and think rationally. Maybe an animal, I told myself. A deer dragging a branch? But the metallic glint was strange, and the dragging noise didn't sound like hooves or claws. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the dirty windows. The forest outside looked peaceful and green, birds singing in the distance. But I hadn't slept well. I kept thinking about last night's sounds and the metal object near the cabin. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the area. The ground was damp with dew, and the air smelled fresh. Near the back of the cabin, I found the object. A small, rusted metal box half buried under some leaves and pine needles. I knelt down, brushing off dirt and debris. The box was locked with a heavy padlock, but its edges were rough, corroded. I tried lifting it, but it was surprisingly heavy. My mind raced with questions. Why was it here? Was it dropped or left on purpose? I took the box inside, setting it on the table. I examined it closely, noticing scratches and dents, signs of long neglect. I didn't have the tools to open it, but I planned to try later. The rest of the day I spent exploring the woods. The trees were thick and close, the ground covered with ferns and moss. I found animal tracks, deer, raccoon, maybe a coyote. A small creek trickled nearby, its water clear and cold. The forest was peaceful, but the sense of being watched lingered. I didn't see anyone, but I felt eyes on me, a constant weight pressing in. Back at the cabin, the sun was dipping again when I heard movement in the woods, a crunching of branches as something large moved slowly. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, shining the beam into the darkening trees. No animals ran off, no sounds of flight, just the heavy, steady rustle. I walked around the perimeter, shining light everywhere. Then I noticed footprints, large, heavy, fresh. They led from the woods right up to the back of the cabin. I followed them carefully, feeling more uneasy by the minute. The prints stopped near the spot where I found the metal box. Inside the cabin, I sat staring at the box, now more than just a curiosity. I kept hearing noises outside, the forest alive with hidden things. I set traps around the cabin with wire snares and sharp sticks, not expecting to catch anything but hoping to know if something came close at night. That night, I kept the fire going and sat with a knife close at hand. The The forest seemed louder than before, every crack and snap echoing. The metal box sat on the table, a silent, dark presence. Around midnight, the noises started again. Soft shuffling, dragging sounds just outside. My breath hitched as I grabbed the flashlight and shone it through the windows. The beam landed on a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. A man, tall, with a coat that blended into the shadows. His face was obscured, but his eyes reflected the light briefly. He didn't move, just stood watching. I didn't call out, didn't make a sound. The figure turned and disappeared into the woods. I locked all doors and windows, moving silently to prepare for dawn. In the morning, I searched outside. The man's footprints were everywhere, around the cabin, circling close. No tracks leading away, just a perimeter. That day, I decided to open the metal box. I found an old rusty crowbar in my bag and pried the lock open with effort. Inside was a small notebook and a few photos, all worn and dirty. The photos showed the cabin years ago when it was new and people smiling in front of it. But there were other photos too, men with weapons, camping gear, and maps marked with red circles. The notebook was filled with handwritten notes about hunting spots, trails, and warnings about trespassers. The more I read, the clearer it became. The cabin wasn't just a place to relax. It had been used for something else. Hunting, or something more serious. As the days passed, the man didn't show again, but I knew he was still out there, watching. I packed up my things early, locking the cabin behind me, taking the box with me. The drive back was tense. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I imagined eyes in the trees. When I finally reached the town, I went to the sheriff's office and handed over the photos and notebook. They knew about the man, a local who had been living off the grid, wary of strangers, known to patrol the woods and intimidate anyone near his territory. They assured me the man was under watch, and the cabin was being checked regularly now. I still think about that place sometimes, the quiet, the dark, the feeling of being watched. But I also know I did the right thing. The cabin is safe now, and I'm safe too. I learned something important from that trip. Sometimes, the scariest things are not ghosts or monsters, but real people and the secrets they hide. The forest doesn't forgive trespassers lightly, and some places have shadows that don't come from the night, but from the living.